Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage foreign policy publisher and CEO, Andrew Sollinger.
Hi, everyone. Fresh from lunch, which is appropriate for a very important discussion on food. We still have people finishing up and checking in right now, but we have a schedule to keep, so we're going to get started while everyone else joins us. And I wanted to kick off. I don't like reading things when we're beginning events, but I wanted to read you something, and it goes like this. Last year, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the world feared a collapse of the global food system. The war did end up triggering a food crisis, leading to rising hunger and soaring food prices. But one of the bright spots of 2022 was that the international community came together to prevent a full-blown meltdown of the world's food system. Unfortunately, the food crisis is not just last year's problem. Last year's efforts were a stopgap solution, and 1 year later, the world is one major crop failure or natural disaster away from a food systems meltdown. That was written by the great Eartharin Cousins, who was just here this morning and has a schedule conflict this afternoon. I did not know she was going to be here this morning. I had already decided to speak to that, and it's in a story that she wrote, How to Prevent a Meltdown of the Global Food System. And that was in Foreign Policy in April of 2023. You can find that online right now. And one of the great 2022 initiatives that she cited as a reason for hope was the Black Sea grain deal. And that is now collapsed. I don't know that that's the one step that will take us to food system collapse, but it's not heartening. So this afternoon, we're going to discuss coherent strategies to address global food and water security. And we're going to provoke questions about the resilience of agriculture and fishing industries in light of climate change and in light of conflict. We're going to learn from lessons from these disruptions. We're going to explore how policy and partnerships can foster food and water systems that are more resilient, capable of withstanding geopolitical shifts and those very same climate shocks. This event would not be possible without some very key partners that we have in the room supporting us today and that you'll be hearing from today, including the Texas A&M Bush School of Government and Public Service, Daughters for Earth, co-founded and led by the brilliant Zainab Salbi, who's here with us, the amazing group Food for the Hungry, the International Fertilizer Association, which is very much wired into sustainability. We'll be talking to them later. Our friends at Unilever and the Walton Family Foundation, which underwrites The Catch. The Catch is our excellent podcast on ocean fisheries. It's going into season 3, which we're about to launch. And it actually was just nominated for a Signal Award. So you could go online and vote for that. And you can subscribe or listen to that podcast. Actually, we have cards out on your chairs. You can zap the QR code and check that podcast out. It really is brilliant. If you're joining us online, you can submit your questions right on the website. You'll see the form for that. We've been doing that all day. And if you're here in the room with us, you can use the QR code on the handout on your chair to zap a question to us. So I'd really like to kick right off into the discussions and keep us on schedule. And I am super thrilled to welcome Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the president of AGRA, who is a wonderful speaker, and we're very thrilled to have her here with us. Dr. Kalibata. So, at the end of 2022, the FAO identified 45 countries that were in need of imported food assistance to avoid severe food shortages. 33 of them are in Africa. And earlier this week at the Food System Transformation session at this week's SDG Summit, also around Climate Week, you focused on this problem and the systemic problem that we have, agricultural job creation. And just to quote you yourself, to refresh you on what you said, the speed we are currently using means that if we don't do things differently in 2050, Africa will be the hungriest and poorest continent. Africa doesn't need that, and the rest of the world doesn't need that. I'd like to just throw that over to you and ask, this is a big question, obviously, but what do we need to do to try and grapple with this problem now?
No, good. Thank you for having me. And you started this conversation with the Russia-Ukraine crisis and what's happening with the Russia-Ukraine crisis. What that crisis has done is to put to question trade as we know it and how the rest of the world gets to work together around trade. But before that, there was the COVID crisis, which also did put to question value chains and supply chains as we know them. So the hunger we are seeing is a combination of so many things. But at the bottom of it all is really the whole issue of climate change. It's very clear that Africa, especially Africa at the equator, is going to be very difficult to have food and to build food systems that are resilient if we don't deal with the question of climate change. So the whole thing of 1.5 degrees for Africa is a lifeline. Many times we talk about it like something that is, aspirational, but for Africa it's a lifeline. And if we don't, what you're seeing in Kenya, where you get a drought of 3 years in a row, 6 years in a row with no single rain, what do you expect? Communities completely lose the ability, sometimes even starts eroding the knowledge of how to produce food. So I think this is a whole combination of things that we are seeing, and it will get worse if climate change doesn't improve. And I guess the biggest thing is, does any country have the ability to invest in this and really be able to turn the tide? For Africa, no, because 60% of the countries in Africa are also struggling with debt. So this is a problem that's going to be here for some time.
This is an intertwined crisis between climate, finance, and so much of it drawing together into a web that's very hard to climb out of. One of the things that you talked about is that we are spending a lot of money to keep people alive, and that we need to move on from keeping people alive, which is very important, to creating jobs for people and advancing development on the African continent. How do we do that?
So I've thought about that a lot, because when one says, we need to move on from keeping people alive, sometimes it sounds like you're not being real. People need food now. So what do you need to do to keep people alive while not paying attention to the people that are hungry? But there are a few things we could do. One of the things we could focus on right now is to try to stay ahead of the problem. We know the problem is here. We know climate change is not going anywhere anytime soon. So why don't we stay 6 months ahead, 3 months ahead, and ensure that we are working with countries and communities and that they have the resilience they need to be able to deal with this problem? Because it only takes 3 months to produce a good crop. So, and we do have a lot of information now in our world. Weather information exists. How do we make sure that this weather information becomes available to communities, to countries, so that, why isn't it a public good now where we live today? Maybe it should be a public and easily available, public good and easily available. So when we do that, we would then be able to say, and invest in making sure that we can move communities ahead of time. We can plan ahead of time. Rather than we come through, amazingly, we are able to come through as a world in terms of feeding people. But we can come through just 3 months before, 6 months before. That would mean that these communities will be building their own strength and resilience. And next time, they probably won't need you coming through after the fact.
Right.
So that's one thing. The other thing is to think about financing, and viable and valuable financing. So I worked at country level in the agriculture sector. I worked with farmers, and every time, and I know there are public institutions that do fund these countries here. I mean, we have really unbelievable institutions out there. Every time we got a loan of, $50 million to fund my country for agriculture, I asked, so $50 million over 10 years, a loan to pay 10 years. We are 13 million people. My country is one of the smallest, 13 million people. Tell me, divide that by per capita investment. 0.000001 for per capita investment. So really zero impact in the end, but get it right, the debt piles up. The debt is real, because that $50 million is a debt. So it piles up, it piles up, it piles up, and the transformation is not there. So maybe we need a different transformational plan if we are going to deal with the question of feeding 65% of the people out there that are living in agriculture, creating jobs for 77% of Africans now are young people below 35. They need jobs. We need the Marshall Plan that will invest in real-time real people and get things done in real time. We can't just do drip investments.
Right. We're just pushing the problem forward.
Yeah.
You've also called for more action to promote intra-Africa trade.
Yeah.
And maybe you could speak to a little bit why that's important, what the problems are behind that right now. There's infrastructure issues, political issues. Why is that so critically important?
So when I talk like this, it seems like I'm talking to the rest of the world. But actually, intra-Africa trade is an African problem that we are not solving. So as Africans, we need to also think through why do we have intra-African trade that's still at 15%? Where are we competing where we shouldn't be competing? There's competitive advantage, there's comparative advantage between countries that we can take advantage of. And there are challenges, institutional challenges that we can sort through. So the African continent put in place the intercontinental trade to help deal with all these border challenges, deal with food and food quality challenges and standards that will allow anything that sits between trade and the trading that needs to happen. That's part of what the intercontinental trade area needs to address. And my institution in particular is committed to working on the food side and supporting countries to working on the food side of trade, because we've noticed that one thing that has held the continent back so far on food security, it's because nobody trades in food security. Trade is in food. And Africa does not trade in food with itself. Africa gets food from everywhere else except itself. Now, with COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the realization that Africa can trade with itself with food is actually real, and the opportunity is actually real. So just working on some of these challenges and making sure that we as a continent can start prioritizing eating what we produce and have the ability to produce, and producing what we need to eat might even be good for the environment as well.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So I know you have to go in a few minutes, but I wanted to harken back to a conversation that we had several months ago last year at the FP Food Summit in December. We were talking about fertilizer. And one of the key issues that we discussed then was, and a tremendous concern for food systems in Africa, was fertilizer shortages due to the war in Russia and Ukraine, and the call to create, which is, again, a carbon-intensive product, fertilizer, to create an indigenous African fertilizer industry, which also relates to trade and the ability to move ammonia across borders and the like. I'm wondering if there's been any progress on that front since we last spoke about it in December.
So there's been a lot of progress, not where we should be, but I think there's a lot of progress. So I can, off my 5 fingers, say 5 countries where I know they are trying to do something about fertilizers, whether they are partnering with organizations that already do that. I see organizations like OCP that produces phosphate on the continent.
Yep.
In 2016, we committed to produce blended fertilizers across 17 countries in Africa. They've started doing it. They are launching a plant, for example, in Rwanda next week. They are doing it in Ghana. So there are some of those that are coming up. Yara, and I see them in the audience, is working with a number of countries. I think they are launching also a blending facility in Tanzania, and they are working with the government of Tanzania to do that. Now, a blending facility means something. It means that you don't have to import and to bring long distances stuff that you don't need to be bringing to the African continent. It only means that you can use what is already on the continent with a little bit of what is really needed, the ingredients that are needed, brought at low cost because they are much less, and then be able to mix them on the continent and be able to use them. I guess the question becomes, there are a number of questions to that. First of all, it's access and availability. So these 2 companies and governments are working on that, and there are other sources that I haven't talked about. There are a number of other countries that are looking. For example, Kenya is looking at green ammonia, and there are other countries that are doing that. But what this is saving us, the blending, what is saving us, is just ensuring that you don't have to use a whole lot of fertilizers, but you actually get to use fertilizers. So today in Africa, we use very little, and that leads to degradation of the environment in its own way. Because farmers get very little from the land they are using, it doesn't produce, then they get the next land, they produce what they need, it doesn't produce, then so Africa's agricultural systems are 60% degraded because of low productivity.
Right.
So one of the reasons why fertilizer use is extremely important is to ensure that we get to have optimal production, not maximum, optimal production, ensure the balance between, at least the balance between the needs of people and the needs of the environment. That's how I look at it. Other people look at it differently. But if you're an African like me, working with farmers to make those poor soils productive, the use of fertilizers in quantities that are necessary, not unnecessary, necessary for the soil then and for the plant then, it's something that we have to deal with. Of course, globally, we need to start thinking about what you said, that fertilizer is one of the most polluting industries. We need to think about how to step back from that. So, and again, there are lots of transitions we have to work through. This is one of them. How does Africa transition from its low productive agricultural system, and how does the rest of the world transition from its high emitting agricultural systems?
We're talking with Elzbieta Klein of IFA, your friend, later today. So I will ask her that very question when it comes up later. Yeah. I know you have to run to your next meeting, Catalyzing Action at the UN. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Agnes Kalibata.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That's right.
And now, please welcome to the stage Hanneke Faber, President of Unilever's Nutrition Business Group, Mark Isbell, partner at Isbell Farms, and Sam Cass, partner at Acre Venture Partners. This discussion, Reviving the Earth, Regenerative Agriculture and a Sustainable Future, is moderated by Maggie Lake, veteran journalist and founder of Maggie Lake Media.
I think the mics are working. If not, they'll pop up in a minute. But it's great to see everyone back. So we're going to continue on, pick up right where the last panel left off. And they were discussing and ending on the issue of fertilizer and supply chains. We're going to take it right back to where it starts, talk a little bit about farming and growing. We have a fantastic panel here kind of touching every part of that, which I think is super important. Sam, I'd like to start with you. You've had your hand in every part of the food chain. You were a chef, as well as the senior White House advisor for nutrition for the Obamas, and are now on the investment side at Acre Venture Partners. What do you think the state of the global food system is? Just sort of set the table, no pun intended, for us.
The puns are unavoidable in this.
Yeah, they are. I feel that. It's actually not part of my brain.
Hi, everybody. How's everybody? Good? Good to see you guys. Look, it's a big, loaded question. And obviously, there's a lot to be proud of, right? We're feeding a lot of people, but we're also not feeding a lot of people. It's almost 1 billion people malnourished, undernourished, and about 2 billion who are overweight, obese. So we have some real challenges in the status quo, but due to climate and the shifts we're seeing, I think we're at severe risk for some pretty difficult days ahead. And many of the foods that we know and love and take for granted, like coffee, wine, chocolate, crustaceans, shellfish, nuts, are really in threat by, our kids and grandkids may not have access to those basic foods that we all know and love. And major commodities which underpin stability and security around the world are set to see pretty dramatic declines in the coming decades. And I think that puts a tremendous amount of risk on our ability to feed ourselves. And as we've seen examples of, when people don't have enough food, you see a lot of political instability, a lot of forced migration, and conflict that arises from that. And so what we do now, the actions that we take to lower the footprint of the system, it's about a third of the world's carbon emissions, 70% of the world's water goes into ag, #1 driver of biodiversity loss and deforestation. We have to lower the footprint there. We have to also start to really invest in adaptation and our ability to grow food in a much more volatile climate. But for me, even in the face of pretty dire future, if you look at what the models are showing us, I think food and agriculture is the only system on Earth that has the ability to sequester enough carbon to make a difference in the global footprint in the time horizon that the science says we have to make that difference. None of these other like carbon capture, suck it out of the air technologies are going to come anywhere close to scaling in the time we need. And food and ag holds that potential. And we're seeing some examples, you'll hear today, of real models in progress that could actually start to really do that. So that gives me hope, even though the models and science are telling us that the future is quite grim unless we take much more aggressive action than we are today.
Yeah, that's the action part, but the plan part, having a plan is important and a way forward. So Hanneke, that sort of brings up your piece in this, because I mean, this is a business resiliency, business threat, as well as a climate and planet threat. How are you thinking through this? And talk to me about this investment in the adaptation. When Sam said that, and Sam, we'll get more specific on what Acre's doing in this too, but how is Unilever investing in this? What way do you see forward?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said it. It's about resilience, it's about emissions. We are committed to regenerative agriculture. That is not charity. That is not a nice to have. And I think for many years, people thought, oh, you know, this is for like the greenest companies, the most progressive. It is no longer that. If we don't change the way we farm, we're not going to have enough food. And that's already has been an issue in Africa, of course, as Agnes outlined just now, forever. But the same thing is going to be happening here in the U.S. and in Europe, and we're already seeing it. So we're going to talk about a couple of our big crops today that we're investing in, but one of them is tomatoes. Last year, the tomato harvest in Spain was down by 40% because of drought. 40% fewer tomatoes. And if, like me, you sell a lot of tomato soup and ketchup, this is a problem. So we have to change the way we farm. So that's what we're doing. We're doing that for a more resilient supply and food security. And we're doing that because there's no other way any food company can meet their lofty net zero commitments. What are we doing? We've put aside €1 billion in a climate and nature fund to support farmers, and Mark will tell you how we're working together on a crop, rice in Mark's case. We're rolling out regenerative agriculture practices. Sometimes we spend too much time on the definition of what is a regenerative agriculture and what is a practice. We're not going to do that today. What's important to us is impact. And the impacts we're definitely seeing. So we, this week, I think are the first big food company who have published results, impact results of our regenerative agriculture investments, programs that have been in the field with farmers for 3 or more years. And what we're seeing on those tomatoes in Spain, by the way, my competitors had 40% fewer tomatoes, but we didn't because we're doing regen ag, so that was good. We had enough ketchup. But we're also just published 37% fewer greenhouse gas emissions from the regenerative practices in tomatoes, and 173% increase in pollinators from simple interventions like biodiversity strips. So we love that, and then Mark's going to talk about rice, but I can tell you the methane reductions from the practices Mark is implementing are shocking. So 76% fewer methane reductions from the practices that Mark is implementing. So we are so proud and so thankful, and it's also really good and nutritious rice. So yeah. I think you'll want to hear more about that.
And I think that. Yeah, are we all can use this? Yeah, okay. We're on the hand. Is this?
Hello? Okay. It's super important that you say that, though, because in all of these discussions, the numbers matter, data matters. This is what is going to enable people to take this and say, get the financing, get the buy-in. So this measuring it is incredibly important, right? Any SDG conversation, you'll hear it. If we can measure it, we can manage it. So that's super important. Mark, so tell us what this looks like on the ground. And I feel like what used to be a distant conversation is now front and center to so many people because of the headlines. We've all experienced a shortage. We are seeing the lack of foods we're used to having everywhere now in the world. So it's not isolated. I feel like it's very much in the popular conversation. Right. So tell us what that looks like on the ground. I'm going to pass the mic to you because
I think this one's working actually. Okay, it seems like so. So this is the first I'm hearing of the potential tomato shortage actually. So I can say for my children on the ketchup front, we're grateful that you fixed that problem.
I second that.
Yeah, but I'm here to talk about rice and the program that Unilever has worked on our farm in particular. And why is rice important to the world? First of all, it's 20% of the calories in the entire world come from rice. And why is it an issue with methane? And that's because soil, at least healthy soil, which we all aspire to have, is teeming with life. It is just, they say that there's more microorganisms in a handful of soil than there are people in the world. And so some of those microorganisms, when they're wet, they create methane. When they're inundated with water in an anaerobic environment, they create methane. But when you dry them down and you let them have some air, they don't create as much methane. So when we look practically what this looks like in rice production, rice is typically grown in a completely flooded situation. But if we can periodically allow air to get to the soil throughout the year, not only can we use less water, but we can also reduce that methane, as Hanneke said, by 76%. And it's very meaningful. It saves water, it saves methane, and it's been a very beneficial thing. Now, from Unilever's perspective, what I appreciate that they have done, I've been working in this space for a lot of years at this point with different organizations. And there was initially sort of a concept that farmers should just do these things, right? And what wasn't realized is there's real risk, there's real cost involved into making these changes. And unless you have people that are willing to help you get over that hump and incentivize those things, then you can't expect someone to make that change. And so rather than companies trying to set their goals, externalize the cost of those goals down onto the farmer, which is not good for any of us, it's imperative that they do like Unilever's done here and say, hey, we're going to put some money behind this. We're going to take this seriously, and we're going to try to help find a solution to this issue. And that's an example of how we've done that this time.
I think that's hugely important because that's risk mitigation, right, at its core. I mean, you have to have a partnership like that rather than just push the burden down. And I think you maybe recognize an obstacle of what's been standing in the way. Sam, can this scale, can this be applied? How are you thinking about this from an investment point of view, especially given what Mark just said, that there is an upfront investment that's needed?
Yeah, I mean, I just need to point out like what a big deal this is. First of all, this is Unilever's entire U.S. rice footprint. So this is the entire supply chain for rice that they have. And if you would take this model that's been done and put it across the globe, about 10% of arable land in the world is farming rice. It's about 11% of the global agricultural emissions come from rice, and about 34 to 43% of water in agriculture is going to rice production. And so if you take this model and start to apply it around the globe, you're talking about cutting the overall food, which is over a third of the global emissions footprint, by 5%, just right there, just on rice. Just if we do collectively what Unilever's figured out how to do in partnership with innovative, incredible producers. It's hard to overstate what a big deal this is. And Hanneke, I just congratulate you on your leadership on these issues to really try to figure out how to make this work through the value chain. And I think without understanding the economics for growers and making this work for them, none of this is going to scale. And we have to think about supports, incentives, and for what we're seeing from the investment side, new tools and technologies that can dramatically improve a producer's ability to sequester carbon or reduce their emissions, so that value can start being pushed through the chain. Ultimately, we'll find new sources of either having to pay a little more or other sources of offsets from other parts of the economy to help us drive this transformation and make the numbers work. But we have a model here, unlike, quite frankly, anything I've seen in the industry, of showing how far we can go with the right interventions. And really, this is what the future needs to look like.
And let us not be naive, by the way, on, is this investment ready? This is companies leaning in and funding. So in this case, Unilever and some of our suppliers as well, so the big traders, leaning in and paying farmers like Mark a small premium for going through this transition, because it is a risky transition. It's hard work. Yeah. So as Mark said, he's not going to do it if we just say do it. But I am convinced that leaning in is worthwhile for, again, the resilience. I had the tomatoes. Some of my frenemies did not. And also because as a company, we have committed to being net zero by 2039. Oh, my God. And we don't quite know how to get there. But I certainly know if I don't massively reduce the emissions in our agricultural Scope 3 supply chain, we're never going to get there. So that investment is worthwhile. It's manageable, absolutely manageable. And I need more of our friends in the industry to come along with us, as well as then support from governments, from NGOs. And what we need from government is the policy environment that makes it last. And it's fascinating what Mark was saying in the green room on the policy environment on water and how that influences rice.
So I think this is a great, and Mark, I think you're in a perfect position to talk about this because you're a fourth generation farmer, if not, I'm not mistaken. So I'd love to hear about the willingness of farmers to make the change if they have the support, and what does the policy look like? Because none of this is in a silo. We say this over and over again, but you need intersecting policies to come together in order to create, I think, the backdrop for you to succeed. So talk to me a little bit about the desire for change and what do you need in terms of those policies?
Yeah, absolutely. And leading into that, I'd just like to contextualize it by saying, we're asking what will it take to get farmers to do that. Let's look briefly at what farmers have done over the past, say, 60 years. In the U.S., at least, we're spending 33% less of our disposable income on food than we were 60 years ago. We're feeding twice as many people in the U.S., and we're feeding 3 times as many people in the world. As Sam pointed out, there are some issues with that. We haven't met it perfectly, but there was a challenge. There was a question at some point of whether we would be able to produce enough food to feed the world, and we did. And there are repercussions to that, right? And creating this affordable food supply, there has been, it creates its own challenges too. So, I was reminded of a meme from several years ago back, and it was focused on college students, and it said, choose 2. It's so you can have a social life, you can have good grades, or, you can have plenty of sleep. Choose 2, right? So, now as a farmer, I hear people saying, okay, you can stay in business, which here at Foreign Policy, with the backdrop of we need to have a food system in the United States that is secure and able to provide food. That's the backdrop. We want our U.S. farmers to stay in business. They stay in business, provide an incredibly affordable, cheap, if you will, food supply. And, oh, by the way, please solve climate change too. So we can work on each of those, but you've got to give just a little bit on something. And what Unilever has realized in this, and what I applaud them for, is the one that you give on is you're going to have to give just a little bit of that margin, or maybe the customer is going to have to give just a little bit more to incentivize that change. But unless you're willing to do that, let's be honest, it's farming has to be a business if we're going to stay at it, right? Absolutely. And we cannot make these changes unless companies adopt the same type of concept, that the emissions that happen on the farm associated with this food production are not my, as a farmer, emissions. They are the footprint of the consumer that has to have that. And what I'm able to do is steward the production of that food in such a way, if you will help me, and you are, if I can steward in such a way that I can help reduce the emissions of those consumers while trying to keep this triangle and some level of perspective.
Yeah,
I think for both Hanneke and Sam, I think this is, again, where the data matters, right? Because if you give consumers tangible evidence that the premium they may pay, if it goes to them, is going toward real change, then you get buy-in, as opposed to broad promises. Then it's harder. And the same thing with investment money. If we're getting down to nuts and bolts, investment money will flow to where there is actual tangible progress. And especially when you start to pile on the virtuous loop you create with climate and food security, that makes a difference too. So how important is all of that piece of this?
Absolutely. So our program on regenerative agriculture is global. It goes across today 250,000 hectares, 29 countries, more than 10 different crops. So implementation is part 1 of that, but part 2 of that is measure, report, and verify. Because we're only doing this to create more resilience and to reduce emissions, reduce water, increase biodiversity, and get to net zero in a way that improves farmers' incomes, because otherwise none of it will last. So absolutely 2 critical elements. And again, we are absolutely happy to fund that transition, but we will need government to then put the policy environment in place so it lasts. So I'm very happy to see Shavonda there at the USDA. And I think actually here in the US, you guys are doing a great job in creating that policy environment and some of the research and the data. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Sam, your thoughts on?
On the data side, we're actually investing directly into platforms to provide this data for companies. One of the companies I'm most excited about is a company called Planet Forward, which does much more affordable life cycle assessments and decarbonization recommendations based on that data, on the footprints of companies' operations in Scope 1, 2, and but most importantly, really, when you look at the data in the food and agriculture space, 90% of most companies' emissions plus are in Scope 3. And right now, the data for Scope 3 has been pretty poor. And so what you see really across the board is companies making big, bold statements, which is a great first step, but without any kind of real actionable data to understand really where the company is from a footprint perspective, and then how to measure and track progress and make decisions with a platform that could start to integrate your carbon implications of a decision into that process. And so there's a big gap about how to operationalize these goals because that data is missing. So the teams are like, okay, I hear you, CEO, but like, I don't know if that almond or this pistachio, what's the implication? And so you cannot make those kind of decisions. So we've invested directly in trying to build that infrastructure. And I think if I would say one thing to do that every company should do is like, there's a couple others out there too, to pick somebody and get that embedded because the teams can start to work with that data. Without that data, and that's true both on the agricultural side, but then through the rest of the implications of your footprint, you're just not going to know how to make a decision, and you can't justify ROI on any one of those investment decisions. And so it's critical. And without better data, we're just going to see small incremental progress, but nobody who creates a new way of working in terms of driving these changes forward.
Yeah, I like that you call it infrastructure. All we talk about right now is infrastructure spending, and this is another form of infrastructure, maybe one that is earlier on. It doesn't exist anymore. Some of this is building it from scratch. Mark, we'll finish up with you since you're a boots on the ground. I see you nodding as they're talking.
So the data is so important, and I think that's one reason, in addition to the farm, that I've co-founded with some others, a company called Arva Intelligence that's just focused on making sure we can ingest this data from the farm and package it in such a way that we give it to the CPG, like Unilever, and it provides the veracity and the integrity of that claim. We know it happened. We know it had this result because we have the analytics behind that. But what is also incredibly important, if you come to me as Unilever and say, I want all of this data, and maybe you're going to pay some extra for that, that's great. Maybe I do it. But what if you come to me and say, okay, we're going to take this data. We're going to use it so that we can prove that we met our Scope 3 emissions reductions. But also, I'm going to help you analyze that data and help you make decisions on the farm that not only takes what you're doing now and helps me monetize that as Unilever, but helps you make new decisions that create new environmental benefits. So we've got to take that data and look at it from both directions. Yes, we have to have it to have the integrity behind the claim, but we also have to use that data in a way that respects the privacy of the farmer, of course, but give something back to that farmer so that they can make decisions that take them even to the next level. Yeah. And I think that's incredibly important. Yeah. And then just on your statement as far as the government goes, we've got the Climate Smart Partnerships that came out recently, and I believe Secretary Vilsack will be here later. There have been a lot of positive movements on this front, on what the government can do, what the USDA can do to help incentivize some of this. So it's an all-of-the-above approach. Okay, farmers can make decisions. They can, with help of others, make some changes. Private enterprise, large multinational companies can make a change, and the government has a role to play too. But if we're going to solve this problem, we have to be realistic about the fact that it costs money, and that has to come from somewhere. And I'll leave it to the marketplace to decide where that comes from. But sitting on the ground, I can tell you that it takes it to make change. And we all know that. we know that in our own personal lives, so we should expect it in farming and agriculture as well.
Absolutely. But again, I believe those investments are modest in the big picture, and the payoff is huge. 76% methane reduction across all of our rice for the U.S. I mean, this is huge.
Yeah.
And I think one of the encouraging things, and we'll end on Sam's note of optimism, the challenges are huge, but what I'm hearing is that solutions are there.
Yeah.
The technology is only going to get better in terms of predictive modeling that will help. We just really need to supercharge that. SDG 17 exists for a reason, right? The public-private partnerships, and when you get the investment piece, the farmer, companies coming together, and government, then it sounds like there is an awful lot to be hopeful for. Thank you so much. Fantastic conversation. Thank you all.
And now please welcome to the stage Dr. Purnima Menon, the Senior Director of Food and Nutrition Policy at the International Food Policy Research Institute, Zainab Salbi, the co-founder of Daughters for Earth, and Geeta Sethi, World Bank Advisor and Global Lead for Food Systems. This panel discussion on women at the forefront of regenerative agriculture is moderated by FP's Vice President of Research for FP Analytics, Dr. Maisha Alam.
Hi, everyone, and welcome, and thank you again for being here. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to moderate what is an incredibly important discussion about not only the impact that climate change is having on women who comprise the majority of smallholder farmers in the world and who lead the work that goes into ensuring that there is food in much of the world, but especially in low and middle income countries, but also the incredibly important role that women have to play in safeguarding those systems and the ways in which regenerative agriculture can offer opportunities for the future. And we have an incredible range of expertise on this panel, and I'd love to dive right in and actually start with you, Purnima. We were just talking about this actually backstage, and I think it'd be wonderful to bring the conversation to the stage here, which is, can you help the audience understand the central role that women play in the global landscape of agriculture? And how does climate change threaten those food systems, and how can women who are part of regenerative agriculture build resilience to those shocks and ensure that their leadership is front and center of solutions going forward?
That's a mouthful of questions. So, let me start with the first. So, over the last, I'm going to say several decades now that IFPRI has been doing research on women in agriculture, we've learned a tremendous amount about not just women's roles in agriculture, but about the challenges that women face in fulfilling perhaps their potential to support agriculture of different kinds. And so, I think what we need to shine a spotlight on is the persistent gender-related inequalities that exist across the agriculture landscape. What have we learned in the last decades of implementing primarily conventional agriculture about persistent gender-related inequalities? And then we have to ask ourselves, how is that likely to play out as we look to transform agriculture itself? So, for example, we've learned that women lack access to land. That's just the most basic and fundamental requirement to engage in agriculture. We've learned that women often lack access to information, access to credit. And so, if we know that's what things look like, on the one hand, from a problem landscape. On the other hand, from a solution-scape, what we know is that when women are empowered, when women come together in communities in particular around agriculture, that they are empowered to, and they do ask for nature-positive solutions. We've seen that in our work in Kenya, we've seen that in our work in Bangladesh. So I think we're at a point now where we understand both the challenges as well as some of the solutions in this space, and we understand what women themselves are interested in. So now the question is really, what are we going to do about this as we look to transform agriculture itself? are we going to acknowledge women's roles in a really central way? Are we going to acknowledge the challenges that women face in a really central way? And are we going to deploy a set of solutions going all the way from policy to how we work with agricultural communities that break these barriers one after the other? So if you have land barriers, you really have to lean in and ask where those barriers are coming from. Are they coming from policies? Are they coming from policies and laws that actually exist but haven't been implemented? And then slowly but surely, we have to knock out each and every one of those challenges. And then I think we say, we'll see the power rise. So let me stop there. Your second question, sort of on the question of, where do women lie, what have we learned about that in the context of women in agriculture itself? I think the second question on food systems and climate change is, quite frankly, the challenge of our times. How do you feed, the billions of people today and tomorrow? And how do we feed these populations with healthy diets? What we know today is that 3 billion people simply cannot afford healthy diets. We're also learning a lot about where food comes from. I'm often I'm a very pragmatic person, right? So we do a lot of research on what people eat and where their food comes from. And there is a certain centrality to markets, regardless of where we sit in community engagements in agriculture. People are engaging with the market, they are purchasing food from the market. And so even as we think about regenerative agriculture, I think we have to really think about how does what's produced in these new ways of doing agriculture end up in markets and in places that people are accessing food from? What do prices look like? What does access look like? What do gender patterns of access look like? And then I think we get to thinking about the transformative power of different forms of agriculture, intersecting with some of what we know are really big social inequality issues in shaping what the world leads forward. Okay? So huge challenges, but I think we're learning a lot. I know many people in the room are trying a lot of things on the ground. As a researcher, I'm always imploring people, invest in learning, because what you do in Kenya can be transformative if people in other parts of the world can learn about it. What women do in India can be transformative in other parts of the world, but without us investing in the learning, we lose the opportunity to share lessons.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I think there's so much to unpack there in terms of the learnings, in terms of the data, in terms of the policy barriers and structural challenges. And that's definitely something I want to touch on a little bit later in the conversation. But to your point about solutions, Zainab, I'd love to turn to you next and bring you into this conversation. You have had an extraordinary career founding Women for Women International, an incredible global organization that's worked on women's agency and leadership and elevating their voices, and more recently co-founding Daughters for Earth. And throughout your career, you've often had to confront compounding challenges, whether that's conflict, whether that's climate change, so on and so forth. And so let me ask you this. Why, at this point in your career, are you so focused on ensuring that there are nature-based solutions, and how are women at the forefront of regenerative agriculture in your view? Are there any examples of promising initiatives that need to be scaled up, or anything that stands out in your mind as this is really where we need to be focusing our energy and our investments going forward?
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here. And as you said, I come from the conflict and humanitarian world, and as my shift to climate change and biodiversity, addressing biodiversity losses has been a relatively recent one. But when it comes to women, I see exactly the same pattern. So in the biggest unusual conflicts, women are impacted the most. 80% of refugees caused by conflicts are women, exactly the same as we are seeing in climate crisis. The most people, the biggest majority of the population that is being impacted by the climate crisis, not only in displacement, not only in food security, is actually women, right, and children. Now, I also, in my experience before, I see women leading a lot of the solutions. In conflict areas, we talk a lot about Ukraine these days. Women keep life going. But the press keeps pushing only as men see conflict. This is no, actually, I'm not even criticizing that. I am criticizing that. I'm not attacking anybody on that, but they see the conflicts as men experiencing it, weapons and all of these things. Same thing in climate change. We're addressing that issue from mostly technology perspective, right? Which is not wrong. It's just not the exclusive solution. And we're not addressing the solutions that actually have nature-based solution, and humans can lead immediately. We do not need to invent something for the future. We can do it today, and it happened to be women are leading that, right? So same in conflict, the media pays attention as men are seeing conflict, not paying attention as women are dealing with conflict, which is keeping life going. Same with crisis. We're dealing with only technology, but what women are doing, and this is a fact, are leading nature-based solutions in terms of protection of land, rivers, water, in terms of protection of biodiversity. It's actually quite amazing what they are doing, and not only on a small scale, but on a large scale. And no one is paying attention to these nature-based solutions, which we can do it today, now, and has immediate impact. And for me, as a non-scientist oriented person, it makes complete sense. When you're sick, the doctor tells you go and rest. Apparently, nature needs to rest a little bit. And that's why conservation or regenerative agriculture is essential in the solution. Now, the third thing that is a pattern in here. In conflict areas, women get 10 cents out of every dollar that goes to humanitarian world. In climate issues, women get 2 cents out of every philanthropic dollars that is going to the issue. That includes agriculture. So it doesn't add up, right? For me, it doesn't add up, because when you talk about, the numbers don't add up. These are people who are impacted the most. Forget about their genders. They're doing a lot of work. They're actually on the front line on both regenerative agriculture and conservation. They're getting 2 cents out of every dollar that is going to the issue. And we are by far not incorporated in the decision-making table. Not process. A colleague asked me, he said, you mean process? No, we are already in the process, but we are not in the decision-making table. The final decision needs to incorporate women. Now, let's talk about agriculture particularly, because we know that this is a fact, right? It's majority of small-scale farmers in the world. We have about 43% of smallholder farmers are women. Of the farmers in the world are women. They produce 70% of the food in Africa alone, and yet they own only 20% of the world's agricultural land. Right? We have data that if women have the same access to resources as men worldwide have, they could grow 20 to 30% more food in the same amount of land they have, lifting 150 million people out of poverty. So for me, the data are there, actually, especially when it comes to women and farming, and especially when it comes to, climate and farming, all of that. What we are not correlating is the financing. Mm-hmm. And I do not understand that. It's like we are in a world that talks about scalability and large-scale solutions. When it comes to women, we immediately shift to breadcrumbs and cents, not dollars. And, you're dealing with an issue of scarcity to half of the population in the world that is essential in solving this issue that we are dealing. So for me, it's ultimately an issue of financing, because women are actually active in these changes. But we need to unless we address that, they're doing it, but we need to ultimately address and incorporate 50% of the population in these essential solutions.
I think that's a perfect segue to bring Geeta into the conversation. You are at the World Bank as the global lead on food systems, and Zainab's just provided us some really important data points, but also I think a clarion call in terms of investments and return on investments, that this is a smart strategic approach, and yet we're seeing underinvestment and a range of structural barriers. So let me ask you this. What do policy structures look like when it comes to regenerative agriculture, and where does financing for women who are in those roles fit into the picture? I'm curious to get your take on what the reality looks like and also where you'd like to see change happen going forward in terms of policy reform and also the mobilization of those resources that are needed.
Thank you. First, it's a great pleasure to be here, and that's quite a boat full of questions, but let me try and do justice to it. Delighted to be part of this, and I see a few familiar faces. Okay, so before I go on to in terms of regenerative agriculture and why the shift is needed and the role of women, let me give a sense of probably what you all know in terms of what is wrong with the system today. One has heard often, and we are in Anga on the eve of COP28, that food systems is not fit for purpose. Today, 33% of emissions is from the sector, and it is going to be the highest emitting sector with business as usual by 2050. And yet, climate finance, which to date has been about 660 billion, 28 billion has come to this sector, which is about 3%. And when the emissions are 33. So this is a fact. The second is the points that my colleagues made here. Every second person on this planet is suffering from some element of malnutrition, either no calories, too little calories, or wrong calories. Now, a system that is so not fit for purpose in terms of the impacts on planets, violating the planetary boundaries, impact on health, can still rely on close to 800 billion a year of public support, 65% of which is distorting. You talked about 2 cents to $1. A farmer, a woman farmer, is getting 35 cents to the dollar right now, not climate, just. So there's not even equity in terms of living income, living wages. So the policy agenda, the repurposing of public support has to change. Right now, the biggest financiers of the food sector are domestic financing. So domestic financing needs to look very different. Now let me come to the role of, and hence the move to regenerative. That's on terms of the public support. Now, on the role of the women there is no doubt, and my colleagues brought this up very clearly, that women are 60% of smallholder farmers are women. Local supply chains are being fed by what they are producing, and yet they do not have access to financing because they have no collateral, as they have no property rights. They do not have access. There's weak capacity, because extension services are not catering to them. It's a big failure globally. There is an issue in terms of nutrition. Again, going back to the policy, a big agenda we've been pushing is the poverty lines. Today, the poverty lines are defined on caloric sufficiency, not nutrition sufficiency. That has to shift in a big way. But more importantly, I think for the sector to actually women are going to be the change agents. There is no doubt about that. Women are much more, women farmers are much quicker to change direction of travel and break the inertia, right? So there has to be a program very much catered to the women farmers for the system to change in a big way. Now, to be able to do that, I think the financing, as I mentioned, is one big agenda. Poverty lines is the next big agenda. But I think the third very important part of the regenerative and role of women is, what does a 21st century farming look like? It cannot be a single business enterprise anymore. Sources of financing, sources of income in the regenerative agriculture world is at least three. One is on the food produced. Second is in terms of eco-services, because regen agriculture really means about being stewards of the land, which means that the eco-service payments have to be very much part of the finance architecture, which means there needs to be a price of carbon. It cannot be $5 a ton. It means agriculture and regen needs to be part of the carbon markets. It's not an option. And the third is renewables, in terms of really being able to produce renewables on their land and using it or putting it on the grid. So this is really the vision of the 21st century farming. And in this scenario, the big shifts that have to happen has to be on the repurposing of the public support. There is no choice there. It has to be, private finance needs to come in a very big way. It is not coming in. And I was at an event a few days ago, and I talked to my panelists about this, and it was a room full of, I think the balance sheet in that room was at least 400 billion, okay? There is money, but it's just not flowing to this sector. And the big agenda they talk about, that one hears about, is risk is very high, what are the bankable projects, blah, blah, blah. Okay. We said, all right, you want big projects? Here are 3 big agendas. Low emission rice. It cuts across geographic boundaries. It has a big impact on methane emission. It's a $20 billion investment. Come in. Low emission livestock. Okay, such an important source done sustainably in terms of dietary needs and so on and so forth. 35 billion. Come in. Agro-logistics, food loss and waste. If it was a country, it would have been the 3rd highest emitter. Okay? Come in. And what did we hear? Geeta, great stuff, and so on and so forth. We're doing great work on adaptation and resilience. Like, excellent. What are you doing? Insurance products for, I said 60 million, 50 million, when the need in the sector to go in the direction we're talking about is between 350 to 400 billion a year for the next decade. And the gentleman says 65 million. Like, you're not needed there. Get the hell out of there. There are other people in that space. You come in where we need big financing. And here are 3 big agendas. So anyway, just to give you a flavor.
No, and you know, I think it's important to talk about these issues with humor, but also frankness, right? Like, this is the reality that you're contending with, and if the 3 of you who are in the positions you're in are confronting these kinds of realities, imagine what it's like for the majority of women who are literally on the front lines and trying to create that change, right? And your point, Geeta, reminds me of something that actually, Purnima, you were talking about earlier, and that's about what do we know and how do we effectively deploy information to decision makers so that we are speaking clearly about not only the reality, but also the opportunities ahead. And so the question I wanted to put to all of you actually is about data gaps and information gaps. And for example, IFPRI has done incredible research around this. The World Bank has obviously done research on these issues for a very long time. So when you think about where we need to be heading, what do you see as the key data gaps, and what do you see as the gaps in terms of information, the correct information reaching those who are moving the dollars and making the decisions?
Yeah. So let me talk about data. So there's data gaps and there's evidence gaps, right? So data gaps are critical to be filled to help us understand what's going on in this world with a 50-50 kind of mentality fully in place, right? And so we think about this in 2 spaces. So one is think about it from a leadership space. The global 50-50 accountability mechanism, really important for us to really keep an eye on this. And that speaks to, you know, issues of women in leadership in the world of food and agriculture. We have to keep our eyes on the ball. If we are not at the table, if we are not speaking up, if we are not in places like this and everywhere that are the other places where decisions are made, we are simply not able to bring certain agendas to the table with enough. I think we need to create space to discuss these, and women are constantly lifting other women up. And so, you know, I think paying attention to data on women and leadership is key, but also paying attention to data on what's happening, not just in farms. I think we've done a really good job on beginning to understand and measure what happens around women in agriculture, but we have to look at this across the food system, right? I mean, we have to expand our data capabilities and the insights from data on where are women included and excluded at every point in the food system. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a big data agenda there. I think around the topic of regenerative agriculture and gender in particular, there's a lot of open questions on evidence per se, right? I mean, lots of things that we don't we make assumptions. We imagine that, it must be so. But what we find often, because we're doing research as our day-to-day, is that we're constantly having to question our own assumptions because the evidence points us in different directions, right? So I think we have to ask questions, for example, such as how effective are gender transformative approaches at actually reducing gender inequalities and enabling the other outcomes that we want to see from regenerative agriculture. How can we use different platforms to bring women into the space and empower them? We really have to ask these questions and ask them with openness. Often women are we want the evidence to say that it all works when we do it, but sometimes it doesn't, and we have to understand why and understand what the constraints are. So again, I think there's the data gaps, but there's also the evidence gaps. And so as we embark on new ways of doing things, new ways of bringing women into the picture, new ways of embarking on regenerative agriculture and addressing, I think, some of the really big challenges that Geeta spoke to, and thank you, Geeta, for your nod to nutrition. I didn't have to say that even as a nutritionist in this room, which tells me we've had some impact on this world. But, even as we move in those directions, we have to take a 50-50 lens to gathering the evidence, to understanding the impacts, not just on the outcomes of healthy diets and affordability of diets and emissions, but also on the inclusiveness and the equity dimensions of these outcomes as we look forward. So I'm going to call for data and evidence for us to look forward to.
I'm not going to touch data because you just addressed that. I'm going to talk about anecdotal experiences because Daughters for Earth, our goal is to find and fund women-led climate solutions, and that actually particularly includes regenerative agriculture, conservation, and renewable energy. And when I set on that goal, I really expected most of the issues that we're going to find is going to be coming out of Africa. And it was an assumption, talk about assumption for me. And to my shock, I learned that those who are leading the shift from traditional farming to regenerative farming, and actually even shifting the farm structure into a holistic farming economy, are not only being challenged in Africa, they're being challenged everywhere. And most of them happen to be, this is anecdotal, women. And I was, to my surprise, shocked that women in Switzerland and in England and in many parts of Europe were being attacked by their own systems and other farmers when they are shifting their farming techniques and they're shifting their agriculture farms into a holistic agriculture, which food production becomes one of the way that they are producing income, right? I was honestly surprised in that shift. They were attacked by medias, by other farmers, by taxations in their economy, in their systems. So we have to address that there is a shift happening. Women are, in my opinion, taking a leadership in that shift for a variety of reasons. I think most of it is practical reasons. They are realizing that they need to do that because they have no other choice. They're getting attacked, but plus not much funding to it. I mean, we have as much demand coming from European women farmers saying, please support us, small-scale farmers, as it is from from Asia or from Africa. And so it's a big issue that we really need to address. But ultimately, for me, again, I go to the mathematics, we are talking about half of the population. We are addressing the most important challenge. I love what you said about respecting regenerative agriculture in terms of carbon credits and all of that. So we've got to incorporate, for me, it's like a practical things, but our practicality when it comes to women cannot be like we almost shift in our mind from big solutions. When it comes to women, it becomes almost small-scale solutions. So we have to be audacious in the solutions in here beside the data.
Okay, so two things, and I know you're running out of time. One is if the shift has to happen in terms of the carbon ecosystem services and getting compensated, MRV systems need to be developed. And we are very far behind versus the energy sector. And that needs to be a big focus, whether it's a multilateral institution or academics or even private sector. I think the second is this shift of the poverty line from caloric sufficiency to nutrition sufficiency means there needs to be a very clear nutrition index, or what I call, where countries don't argue and it's transparent. Otherwise, it's going to get very difficult to define the way there is no argument in terms of poverty numbers. We need that kind of clarity on nutrition. Therefore, then also align the income support programs to be nutrition sensitive. And those are some of the two big, I think, agendas in terms of the data gaps.
Thank you for that. And I think one of the things that's remarkable about this conversation, and to me it feels like we've only barely scratched the surface, is there's so many different aspects here in terms of what we need to be thinking of for solutions, not only working across sectors, but across issue areas at multiple levels. And if I may, as we close out, making sure that the voices of those who are on the ground, indigenous knowledge, the knowledge and expertise and lived experiences of women who are working the land and putting the food on the table and going to market is informing the decisions that are being made. So please join me in thanking this panel for their contributions today, and thank you also for your leadership on these issues day in and day out.
Next, please welcome to the stage Her Excellency Miriam bint Mohammed Al Mhiri, the United Arab Emirates Minister of Climate Change and Environment, and U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack, for a conversation on a food-secure future with FP's Andrew Solinger.
Lots of hellos. Thank you for joining us. Minister, Your Excellency, thank you so much for being with us. Secretary Vilsack, great to be with you again. I had the honor of speaking with Her Excellency and the Secretary at the Aim for Climate Summit in Washington this past May. What a fantastic event. It was massive with lots of interesting projects announced. And for those of you who are not in the know, you should be, but let me refresh you. AIM is the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate, founded in the maws of COP26 in Glasgow a couple of years back. And you have so far mobilized, if I have this right, $13 billion in climate-smart agriculture projects and food systems innovations, launched 51 private sector-led innovation sprints, formed a historic climate-smart agriculture coalition with over 500 partners. How did you do this?
Shall I start?
Minister, please.
Okay. First of all, let me say it's always a pleasure to be here with my partner, Secretary Vilsack. We've come a long way. And if we think about it 2 years ago when we first started thinking about this, and I remember Secretary Vilsack thinking, what does a small country like the UAE, who imports most of its food, want to do with Aim for Climate? And of course, what got us together was the innovation part. So both of us very much rely on innovation. We very much believe in partnership. And that's how this whole thing started. So coming together with Secretary Vilsack and, of course, his team and my team working endlessly on this, we are where we are today. And believe me, and I told Secretary Vilsack this, I think Aim for Climate has really catalyzed where we are with food systems in the climate agenda. I think if it wasn't for Aim for Climate, we would not be where we are today, that there's a food systems agenda for COP28, that COP28 has recognized that food systems transformation should be a priority sector in the COP28 presidency agenda. And so I really want to thank you, Secretary Vilsack, and your team for all that we've done and how far we've come.
Secretary Vilsack.
Well, you've just seen why we've been able to expand Aim for Climate. The minister's been an extraordinary leader in terms of making sure that countries, large and small, understand that we are in this together. I think it's fair to say that whether you are a country that imports or a country that exports, at the end of the day, climate has a profound impact on your ability to produce food. And there's no question that we, as an industry, confront the need to innovate our way to a day where we can adapt and mitigate to a changing climate. I'm excited about COP28 because of the minister's leadership. At COP26, I remember we were at a dinner And agriculture was considered sort of, well, we were eating at the kids' table. I think about back in the day when my kids were growing up, there was a kids' table and an adult table. And agriculture was always at the kids' table at these COP meetings. Always, always, always. We heard about construction. We heard about utilities. We heard about all the big industries. But agriculture was sort of an afterthought. With the minister's leadership, COP28 is going to be the first, in my view, the first COP where we'll be eating at the adult table, which I think is important because I think people do not realize that agriculture has the opportunity to get to a net zero future faster than any other industry. If you think about how you sequester carbon or where you sequester it naturally, you have to have soil, you have to have trees, you have to have an ocean. And the reality is many, many farms across the country and around the world essentially have two of the three, right? So I think agriculture and aquaculture now gets us all three. So it's a tremendous opportunity for us, and we're really looking forward to COP28. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
I'm curious that's a fantastic story, and congratulations on your partnership. What are some top-level learnings of this big undertaking? Lots of big undertakings are announced all the time. And we talked about the two of you and the drive, very kind of the Secretary to credit you, Minister. What are your learnings from this, just in terms of the uptake? We've talked about a variety of different things over the years, trying to make agriculture technology cool. Yeah. What are some of the things that, and you're succeeding at that. I'm just kind of curious what this means to you, just from a learnings perspective and what's possible.
First of all, getting to know so many people from around the world who believe in food systems transformation and understand how important it is for us to make sure we keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. Second, and this was also in Washington, Secretary Vilsack and I, the innovations we saw was truly unbelievable to actually see there are so many innovations there. We just need to scale them up and make sure they get to the right places. I think that was for me also an eye-opener, that such partnership can actually create those kind of platforms where we have lessons learned, where we look at innovations that we never thought would be possible. Because when I look at my own country, we're a water-scarce country, we don't have less than 5% arable land, and actually being able to grow some food items sustainably is all about innovations. And every country has its own resources, every country has its own capabilities, has its own challenges. And so to be able to share and say, you know what, we've got this innovation here, we've got this seed that works here. And this is, for me, the true essence of what Aim for Climate is all about. And of course, getting the partners on board, getting them excited, and knowing that COP28 is coming up in just 71 days now. I don't think food has been this far before a COP as it is now. So when I was in Rome, I actually announced, so I'm very pleased that I am the food lead at the COP28 team. Just to make sure that, again, we have food systems and agriculture on center stage. And we're looking at even small things to what kind of food we will be serving at COP28 and making sure it's as low carbon footprint as possible. This is like mind changing when you think of the caterers, the chefs, the cafes, the restaurants that will be there at COP28. How can they think differently into what food they will be delivering so that we can keep that momentum going? And as I also said, the innovations are key. Innovations in processes, innovations in food loss and food waste, innovations in us in our everyday lifestyles as well. I mean, Secretary Vilsack and I, some of the innovations we saw were really mind-blowing. We'll come to that later. But I just want to say that I think Aim for Climate was really the catalyst that has brought us to where we are today on food systems on the climate agenda.
Congratulations. I would love to, and your passion just comes right through. Thank you. Even though we've all had lunch here already before we started, of course, for our food event, what is on the menu at COP? And I mean that both figuratively and literally. What are some of the plans that you have in place at the big table where food will take center stage and agriculture will take center stage?
So I'm going to keep that a surprise of what we're actually going to be serving. You guys have to all come to be able to experience that. But let me speak a little bit about the food systems agenda. I did announce this in Rome and the UN Food Systems +2 Summit. And the food systems agenda for the COP28 is basically 4 pillars. And this was in consultation with all of you over the past few months. What do we need that we can say we have a clear, let's say, Paris moment for food systems and agriculture. Most of you said we need an agenda and we need political will. And these are the two things that make the essence of the COP28 Food Systems and Agriculture agenda. Number one, it's galvanizing national leadership. I've actually sent out to all ministers of ag, I hope you received it, Secretary Vilsack, the Emirates Declaration on Food Systems, Agriculture and Climate Action. It's a 2-pager of saying we as a country are committed to food systems transformation. We're going to make sure it's part of our NDCs. We're going to make sure it's part of the national biodiversity strategy. We're going to make sure it's part of our national adaptation plans because we are fully committed to this cause. The second pillar is about non-state actors. As you know, we've got the smallholder farmers, the producers, the food processors, academia. So all have to be involved in this. And then we've got the innovation side, and this is where Aim for Climate is one of the key tools that can really catalyze this. And we've proven it with all the technologies that we see today. Then the fourth one is about scaling up finance. And of course, this is one that everyone's trying to crack. I mean, the COP28 agenda has the big trying to fix the climate finance agenda. But in the COP28 food systems agenda, we're looking at how we can unlock from the private sector more money into food systems projects and especially get them there to where they should be. So that's, in a nutshell, the food systems agenda.
That's a delicious menu. So you have the
Yes.
agenda. How about the political will? Where does that come from?
Yes,
That piece? How do you build that?
so the political will, I sent it to the ministers of ag. I've given them a deadline, 27th of September, to write back to me, let me know what their comments are, and then hopefully the first week of October, I plan that our president sends it out to all heads of states around the world to get their buy-in for this declaration. And I hope we have all that before COP28 so we can say this many countries are committed to food systems and ag.
Is this deadline on the calendar, Secretary?
Well, not only is it on the calendar, but we actually are already doing this in the United States. We have the Climate Smart Agriculture Commodity Partnership Initiative where we have 141 projects. We are paying farmers and incenting farmers to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon, incenting them to do so, de-risking the practices. It's all major commodities. Every state of the country is involved. Every production method is involved. Small-scale farming, large-scale farming engaged in this. So we're already there. And we are promoting local and regional food systems to reduce the mileage that food travels. We have a renewable energy aspect of this. We've got a bioproduct, waste to bioproduct initiative that also will help our farmers get to net zero by 2050. So we are there. I have received and read.
There we go. We've got proof that's already arrived.
Read the declaration, and again, it's a reflection of the fact that we're now serious about food and agriculture and seeing it as a significant aspect of this. You know, we want everybody to know what we're doing in the United States, and so we launched at the summit the International Climate Hub, where we're basically going to take the information from what we learned from our Climate Smart Partnership initiatives, and we're going to share it with the world. Because the reality is this is not a situation where one country or one commodity has the answer. We really need to share and collaborate across country boundaries. We're also, as a result of Aim for Climate, we owe everyone a report on how we're doing and the results that we're seeing. I learned today that, you can get a written report that gets filed and maybe read, maybe not. But apparently we're very much into videos these days. Okay.
Yes, I understand that you have a new medium you're going to be.
So we're going to make it easy for people. We're going to be able to allow you to watch and learn. And so we're launching today a video series that's going to enable our 51 Innovation Sprint partners to be able to showcase the results that they are obtaining from their projects. And I think you're going to be interested in seeing IBM. I think is the first video that's getting launched today. So excited about that. The video series. It really is going to show the innovation. It's going to show the impact and what we are learning. And I think what we also need to understand and appreciate is, as important as innovation is, there's already indigenous knowledge out there that maybe sometimes going back in time and looking at what used to happen on farms and ranches around the world, we can learn something as well and potentially reincorporate that back into the way we think about agriculture.
So, of course, love to hear about these innovations. Can't wait for the videos. Really looking forward to the videos, but would love to hear an update. I know, Minister, you are generally an encyclopedic trove of some of these projects. I believe at Aim for Climate, Agrospace was the winner on the day I was there, which is a very interesting Latin American startup. I'm just curious if there's an update on them, maybe to describe that or other projects that you've been monitoring that you think are great Shark Tank-like examples of Aim for Climate success.
So I'm going to talk about 7 areas where there's a lot of innovations happening. So it's improving and delivering weather and climate forecasts, climate resilient social protection schemes, training farmers in on-farm rainwater harvesting, alternative proteins, microbial fertilizer, so this includes also algae, innovators to reduce livestock methane emissions. And I have to say, I was in the Africa Climate Summit last week, and I applaud Africa and Kenya for actually hosting the first Africa Climate Summit. And for me, it was really, it touched my heart to see some of these farmers and how connected they are with their livestock, and that we really have to be careful that anything we do here, we need to think of the just, and we need to make sure that these smallholder farmers are actually still getting an income, because when you remove the livestock from them, you remove their income, you remove their livelihoods. So it's really important that we make sure that any innovations we come up with, that there is accessible of funds that is affordable to them, and that they can do this transition as well and make sure that they still get an income and they can still fill their stomachs as well. And then, of course, there's a lot happening on the digital ag space. We also had the Food Tech Challenge 2.0 in the UAE. We had 4 finalists, or 4 winners, I'll call them. One of them is about clean tech soil improvers. So they use food waste to actually enhance their soil so that the crops need less water. Sustainable Planet are doing plant-based proteins on non-arable land. Reveltech, they have a unique patent-pending freezing technology to keep cells alive. And then Orbisk, AI imagery to basically leverage on automation to quantify food waste in professional kitchens. So really widespread, a lot happening, and I know there's a lot more information, but I know because of time, can't go into all the details.
Some good videos in there, Secretary.
Yeah, speaking of a lot more innovations, we need folks to understand there's a deadline for submitting the next iteration of Innovation Sprints, September 29th. It's also the deadline for new government partnerships. We have 53 countries that are now participating in Aim for Climate. We want to make sure that additional partners get their willingness to join with us prior to September 29th.
Let's talk a little bit about those partnerships and how others can get involved and help you. Aim for Climate is largely funded by governments, but there's other types of partners in there as well, in addition to these startups that can help participate, nonprofits, businesses. What can we do to help with this effort as COP28 approaches?
Well, I think this meeting here today lifts up the significance of Aim for Climate, lifts up the fact that it's grown and expanded. When we started 2 years ago, if you had told the minister, maybe she thought this was going to happen. I will say I didn't know that we would have over 500 partners. We were hopeful that we would have 50 or 60 partners. Now, 500 partners indicates to me that there's genuine interest. Each of those partners has the capacity and capability of contributing something. We should get beyond that $13 billion number. And frankly, a lot of it ought to be coming from the private sector, from foundations that understand and appreciate the opportunity that agriculture and food has for making a meaningful difference. As I said earlier, I think this is the industry that can get to net zero before any of the other major industries if we have a committed effort.
And it's a big emitter. Minister, is it money? Is that really the key thing?
No, for me, I think Aim for Climate is really for partners, by partners. I think that's the key line here. And I think what's so beautiful is that even the innovation sprints are actually made by the partners. So they said, we want to focus on this technology or on this track. And I think this is what makes Aim for Climate so incredible. It's about passionate people who really want to do something and course correct what we're doing on the food system side.
It's also about acceleration.
Yeah.
It's great to have new technology, but we've got to make sure that it transfers into the field and gets to the farmer in a way that the farmer, large or small, can use.
Outstanding. So it goes without saying, congratulations again. It's interesting to see the two of you have come together successfully in this way, and to see you interact actually even as we're coming out on stage, what you've been able to do together. It's really heartening considering what's happening in the world. There's a lot of positive vibes, but achievements that are taking place as a result of that. And you should both be very proud of that.
Thank you.
Well, if we could clone her, we would. There isn't a problem we couldn't solve.
Well, I wanted to thank you both for making the time. I know you're super busy. We really appreciate your coming over here and joining us at our food summit. Thank you so much.
I hope to see you all at COP28.
Yeah. See you at COP28. We'll find out what the menu is.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Next up, please welcome to the stage Teresa Ish, the Oceans Initiative Lead and Senior Program Officer for the Walton Family Foundation. Her Excellency Mavis Hawa Koomson, the Minister for Fisheries and Aquaculture Development from Ghana, and Jim Leap, the co-director of the Woods Institute for the Environment at the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, for a conversation on sustainable fishing and food security, moderated by veteran journalist Maggie Lake.
Hello again, everyone. Super excited to have this conversation because I think, like so many of the others that have come before, we're really going to see that there is an intersection and a lot of positive momentum if we can maybe pull the lens back and look at some of the sustainable development goals in a holistic way and make sure that they're all getting the attention they need. And certainly ocean health and blue foods is right up there. So welcome to the panel. Thank you all for being here. I'm not sure if any of you had a chance to look at FP's website, but there was a story that dropped yesterday that was a really perfect backdrop and setting for the conversation that we're going to be having today. And I wanted to read you the title of it because I think it encapsulates the task ahead. And that is The Other Global Food Crisis. And the subtitle was World Leaders Need to Care About Fish as Much as They Care About Semiconductors. Pretty eye-catching title, I thought, especially see the semiconductor reference in there. So I'd like to sort of bounce off on that. And Teresa, what do we need to understand about the reality of what's happening with our oceans and fish stocks?
Yeah, well, first off, I want to really appreciate Foreign Policy for including a session on blue foods and fish today at the Food Plus Summit, and also make the point that 20% of the animal protein consumed in the world comes from blue foods and fish. More than 3 billion people rely on fish as a significant source of protein, and a far greater number rely on fish for other essential micronutrients. So one panel is not necessarily representative of the importance of blue foods and seafood and fish in our diets and its role in global health and global food security. I think the other thing to recognize, I think we hear a lot of stories about overfishing in the ocean, degradation of the ocean. And what we also know is that when fisheries are managed for sustainability, they recover and they come back. So we really have an opportunity in this moment as we focus on the role of fish in feeding an increasingly hot and hungry planet. There is a pathway forward where we can actually produce more fish, feed more people through sustainable fisheries management and sustainable aquaculture. And that message of hope, I think, is one of the really critical things to remember when we talk about blue foods and the potential out there.
Yeah, and it's been a theme throughout the day, really. Certainly the panels that I've been on is that this is not having to invent a solution. There are solutions out there. This is really about trying to accelerate them. We heard just now in the conversation, the secretary say acceleration and getting it into the field. I mean, that's really what needs to be done, which is a perfect introduction to you, Minister, because you are certainly on the ground having to do that in Ghana. Yes. Give us an idea of how these challenges are, what they mean for Ghana, and then what you're doing. How are you approaching this issue?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I bring you warm greetings from Ghana and His Excellency the President of the Republic, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. Yes, in Ghana, as she rightly mentioned, fish is not just part of our diet, but it's also a fundamental aspect of our culture and the identity of Ghanaians. And so we have a lot of people doing these fisheries, and the challenges that we have is the overfishing, as she mentioned. And also we have the illegal activities, unreported, unregulated fishing activities in the system. Some of the illegal activities are transshipment at sea, use of chemicals, use of under mesh nets, and also use of light to do fishing. And so we have this issue of the illegal activities, and we also have the population being more than the strength of the ocean. When we used to have about 8,000 canoes on our sea, today we have over 12,000. 12,000 canoes, and we also have the trawlers, about 76 trawlers on the sea. So it brings so much pressure on the sea, and these are some of the challenges that we face. And so what we are doing to bring these challenges down is regulating the system. How do we regulate them? By giving ministerial directives that they should use the right fishing gear to do fishing. We've also asked them to stop the transshipment at sea. We've also given the directives of they used to fish for about 3 months on the sea. Now we've given them days, 30 days to fish, instead of about 90, 120 days to do fishing at sea. And we've also introduced a moratorium for the canoes. That's since the canoe used to be 8,000, now 12,000. If we don't have a cut-off point for them, it means it's going to be increasing and increasing. And so we've given them a moratorium recently that they should stop new entries. And we've also made sure that the trawlers are now having EMS, electronic monitoring device, that has cameras on them, so that we'll be monitoring their movements all through their fishing activities. We are now piloting, and so we're making sure that by come January, if you don't have these cameras on your vessels, we're not going to give you any license to do your fishing. And we also have the VMS and then AIS to do monitoring. Upon all this, we also have human, observers who are directly on the ship or the vessel to monitor their activities all day round.
There are a lot of reforms that you've put through that cannot have been easy. How has that been going, and how are you getting the various stakeholders on board? I mean, how have you been able to push it through?
Yes, it hasn't been easy, as you said, but we need to, have stakeholders consultation. We bring them on board and let them understand, because they go for fishing. At the end of the day, when they go, they come empty-handed. And, this pollution of the sea with waste is also there. So when they go, all they catch is plastic waste. And so we sensitize them, we get them to also come in with their ideas. And that is where we have the co-management measures that we bring in the fishers to also come out with their ideas and then tell us what we should do. Whilst we are educating them, we also listen to them to give us some of the directions. So we are co-managing the system. And definitely you have the recalcitrance one, but then when you get the recalcitrance ones, you need to also punish them. And that will serve as a deterrent to their addicts.
But I mean, it's interesting that you're really leading with the listening and co-management aspect to get the buy-in from the very beginning, because if you don't understand what's at stake, without that, I imagine it would be impossible. Exactly. So although there is some, penalty involved, it sounds like the first part of that is incredibly important. To have that local knowledge. Jim, I'm curious, when we're talking about this, it's a complex issue. As we just heard, it's livelihood. It's something in many cases that's been passed down. There's a pollution, climate aspect to it. What do we know from the science in terms of nutrition and what we need to understand about that and how the science can plug into the challenges?
No, thank you. This is an area where the science can actually help us get a new understanding of what's at stake and what can be done with these resources. And there aren't that many governments that are as advanced in their thinking about this or in action as this, as we've just heard from Ghana. And that's because in most parts of the world, we have one category. It's called fish, as if there was one fish. And in fact, there are 2,500 different species produced for food. And they vary wildly in their nutritional content, in their environmental footprint, in their opportunities for livelihoods. So first is just recognizing that diversity. The second is to realize that they're not just protein. We think of them as protein, but they are very rich in an array of micronutrients that are super important for the healthy development of children and for the health of all of us. So in many coastal nations like Ghana, a single serving of small fish caught from the ocean can provide the full recommended daily allowance for omega-3s, for calcium, for vitamin A. And that kind of opportunity is something we haven't really focused on. And so what it tells us is that, in fact, there's much more at stake here than we realized. We can't just manage fisheries as an economic resource. We have to think about all the ways in which they are important to national priorities. And that leads you to the kinds of things that the minister is talking about. And I'll add one other dimension to that, which is if you look at the system, you realize that for all our attention on big trawlers, and we have to come to grips with the damage done by big trawlers, most of the fish we eat globally is caught by small-scale fishers. And so making sure that they are brought into the system, that they are in the kind of consultation the minister just described, that they are helping to develop the solutions and are empowered to manage their resources is centrally important. So that kind of insight actually begins to help us think differently about policy and hopefully will help other countries begin to do the kinds of things that Ghana is doing.
Yeah, and I think that's important to the conversation about economics, because I think the minister really pointed out, and your point, Jim, that this is in many ways a local fishing issue, that it's hard when you're trying to manage the economics of that, when you're talking about a family or a community that may rely on fishing. How do we need to think about that? And I'm assuming that community part of it is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And the economics, I think, for many of the community-based fisheries are often unseen as well. Their subsistence, their additional fishing in addition to their other types of work that they do. But then the seafood industry as a whole, the fish that comes to our plates here in New York and in many other places in the world, that's a $500 billion industry. So there are companies, there are businesses that are large and small that all rely on a healthy ocean and healthy and sustainable fisheries for their longevity. And I think as we talk about the SDGs here, right, these fisheries are critical for alleviating poverty. They're critical for ending hunger. They're critical for biodiversity and health of the ocean. This is one of the only foods that we eat that is also directly part of our biodiversity conversations. And so the imperative to manage fisheries for sustainability, it's an equity imperative, it's an economic imperative, it's an ecological imperative. It doesn't hit just one category, but it really crosses all of our needs in achieving the SDGs and ensuring that we have a healthy ocean and a healthy planet and healthy fishing communities.
Yeah, and we just had a panel on regenerative agriculture where you saw big corporations getting involved, plugging in and funding and mitigating the risk for some of the smaller producers. And we talked about scale. It seems like some of the same problems here and the ability to participate, which is why those partnerships are so important. Because at the end, it's resiliency for the large food companies as well, even if some of the problems are based locally. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 1 in 5 fish that we eat tuna comes from Indonesia. The vessels that those fish are caught on are very small. They can be from very small community boats, and those individuals in a remote community are connected to grocery stores here. And that chain links us all and links all of our responsibility, but especially making sure that those fishers have a voice in the management of their resources and are able to ensure that they can continue to fish and can continue to provide it for us as well as their communities.
And I think there's an education all around and a responsibility to go beyond just, I think we all had that great sleeve of what was overfished when you went to a restaurant. So, stay away from Chilean sea bass now and lean into a fish you possibly have never heard of. To your point, Jim, there are a lot of them, and that's fine, but it's more complex than that, and we need to be a little bit more engaged in understanding the food supply chain. Jim, what about the innovations? How do we need to think about that supply chain? Are there things happening that can help improve that and improve what we're doing in terms of sustainable fishing? How are you thinking about that?
No, there's lots of opportunity here. So let me start where I left off before, which is there's an opportunity to bring a much deeper understanding of nutrition and the sort of opportunities for the food system into decision making. So that's one. So the kind of data that are now being collected will enable governments to make better trade-offs. Doesn't mean you stop exporting fish. Does mean you have a better sense of, okay, what are the competing uses for this resource and how do you make good decisions about it? But then as you look at some of the challenges that Teresa is talking about, one of the great advances of the last several years is a rapidly growing transparency over the fishing sector. For the first time, it is, for all of human history, been largely out of sight, right? And for the first time, we can now see fishing vessels everywhere they go on the ocean and are in a position increasingly to know what they're doing. So that's the first thing. I think second is connecting that to traceability in the supply chain, so you know that the fish you're buying came from that vessel which was fishing in this way. And so there is a growing possibility that supply chains are vehicles for fostering sustainability in a very powerful way. And then I think a next challenge is something Teresa was also alluding to, which is, okay, how do you make sure that that's a system that works for the small producers, whether they are producing for local markets or international markets, and they're not disadvantaged by a push towards sustainability? And that's more and more becoming possible. You have startups like Abelobi in South Africa who are putting a lot of power in the smartphone in the hand of a fisherman that allow him or her to manage their catch, but also to connect to markets directly and begin to thrive in a way that wasn't possible before.
That's super interesting, that ability to connect on the local level. And this is the power of mobility, right, of computing mobility. Minister, it sounds like that's very much what you've had to grapple with. You did talk about putting monitoring systems in. Does that sort of technology and ability to have more transparency into the supply chain, does that help you as you try to protect this industry and protect the ocean and the food source?
Yes, it helps you to monitor the system. As I mentioned about the cameras, the EMS, it gives you lifetime or real fishing time. So wherever you are, you just go on your phone and you see which vessel is doing what. And so you are able to recall the vessel back to anchorage and give the person the punishment or the penalties that the person deserves. I think she was talking about varieties of fish that we have in the system. I think if we are able to also introduce this aquaculture system, it will also help reduce the pressure so much on the sea. And that brings me to solving the issue of livelihood or alternative to the fishers, so that they will not always depend on the ocean. But at least they can have a way of doing rearing of the fish outside the sea whilst they are having this closed season within a month. So when they know, we normally observe the closed season in the month of July and August. So when they know within these 2 months, there will be closed season, somewhere April, they can start with the fingerlings and then start the rearing. By the time they go back to the sea, I mean, they come from the sea for the observation of the close season. They also have something doing there, and they will always be occupied. Not necessarily only giving them the training, but also since they are more interested in the fishing aspect, you give them this alternative to also handle the fishing aspects.
Have you started to farming, basically, fish farming? Right?
Yes,
have
we
you
have
started to look at that? And what do you need from the private sector to help move that along?
Yes, this should be PPP, public-private initiative, so that they can drive it on for us. We have about more than 50 private fishers who are doing this for us. And government is also introducing aquaculture for food and jobs initiative. This is where we also want to bring in a lot of the youth. It can also be served as a means of a job creation to the youth. So we are trying to introduce about 15,000 of the youth into this aquaculture system. As we go year by year, it will be increasing. And the moment you introduce about 15,000 people, at that moment you are talking about around 45,000 to 60,000 people coming into the aquaculture sector. So we have started it.
Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, could I just say a word about this? Because there is huge potential for aquaculture in many parts of Africa. And here's an area where it would be very powerful for investors to come together in support of initiatives like the minister is talking about. Because we know from experience in some countries that to successfully develop an aquaculture sector, you have to be able to move on multiple fronts at once. Right? You need investments in training, help people learn how to fish farm. You need investments in infrastructure that allow fish to get to market. You need investments in value chains that provide the quality of feed and seed it takes to grow fish successfully and markets to sell it into. So you need to figure out how those pieces come together, and that will probably take different kinds of investors. But if they can join forces, then there's a lot of potential in a country like Ghana to really develop a vibrant aquaculture sector.
And this is important because we're talking about food security being paramount, right? So and youth unemployment in some cases in these areas too. So again, this is the intersection of bringing investors together. Suddenly you're solving for many problems, or you're making progress on many of the goals at once when you're thinking about this across border and not just as an ocean issue or simply even a fish issue. Teresa, the jobs, very interesting. You mentioned to me the age of the average. We talk about this sometimes in agriculture. I don't think we think about it in terms of our fishing supplies. There's a problem with labor.
Yeah, and this is another place where you have an environmental and a social component kind of colliding. In the years in the U.S. where our fisheries management was not robust and fisheries declined, it was natural if you had your kids go to college to say, get out of the fishery, find a better livelihood elsewhere. And we're seeing that happen in many places around the world where the fish stocks aren't healthy. The fishermen are told that they're contributing to the decline of the ocean. Get your kids out of college and high school, and they go and they take on different jobs, and the average age of the fishing community and fishermen in many countries is well into their 60s. I think the minister is experiencing something in Ghana that's different, but I think that's also a response to this need to find food in the presence of fish, because if there's no fish to fish, you're not going to stay in the industry. If you see growth in a fishery, you can actually enter, and you see potential, and you see a future.
Right, the problem is driving it out, driving future generations out, and that is exacerbating the problem.
Right.
So you get into a vicious loop. Jim, can we solve food security without fish? Can we solve hunger without fish? It doesn't sound like we can, based on what you said before. Because I say to my kids, the protein tonight is fish. I do that. I'm guilty of that. But it sounds like it's much more than that.
Yeah, I think it would be a big mistake to go after solving the food security problem without fish. Because in so many countries, these resources are there and accessible and affordable, and if well managed, can meet a lot of food system needs. Right? So So there are lots of talk about of innovations in various parts of the food space, and many will have important roles to play. But this is one that's already at the heart of the food system and clearly has the potential to be an increasingly important part of meeting food system priorities in many, many countries.
Why do you think it doesn't get as much attention?
Well, I think it's partly some of the things we talked about. It is, fish are sort of out of sight, out of mind, right? I mean, we all see farms. We don't really get much visibility into fisheries, so I think it's partly that. And then just historically, they have been on the margins because agriculture has really dominated discussions about food. And has been at the center of all of our thinking about food. So I think it's significantly that. I think we've also not appreciated just how much value there is there in terms of the nutrition it offers, in terms of the roles it can play in the food system.
Yeah, and we're at a moment where there's, I think, never been more conversations about health and wellness and doing right by that. So it's a natural plug-in for that. Yep. Minister, I think everyone here has acknowledged, made very difficult and amazing progress on a tough subject politically. What is your advice to others who have not made as much progress as you have, who are trying to tackle these issues in their countries and in their communities? What advice would you give them, and what do you need to continue the progress?
Yeah, thank you. I will advise that we should have the buy-in of our leadership. If our leaders have the strong will to give the support, we'll be able to fight and conserve the fish in the sea or rebuild our depleted fish. And so we should try as much as possible to get the buy-in of our leaders. And we, the policy directors, should also be strong enough. Sometimes, if you are not that strong, you'll not be able to. So you should be determined and make sure that, no, what I'm going to talk about, what strength do I need? What focus? And also bring in the people. As I said, I mentioned earlier, you need the fishers themselves, and that is why you should have this co-management. And on my part, to strengthen what I have done, I think I still need their cooperation and also continue with the measures that I have started. And to end it all is to make sure that you give them the opportunity to also come out and tell you that, yes, what we are doing, we are benefiting from it. Because in Ghana, when we do the close season, after the close season, we still go back, we do the research, and then we know sometimes the length of the fish before and after. That's the growth of it. And we inform them. So the more you give them the information, you should always give them the feedback of your, actions that you take. When you give them the feedback, then they will continue to buy. So that's what we are continuing to do.
Spoken as a true educator, which is where you started, and we were not surprised to hear that, of course. But that is so true. Sometimes these things are put into action, and then the community never hears back on the progress. And when there's progress, then you're motivating people to participate. Can some of this information that we're going to glean from people who are on the forefront, like the minister, can that help in predicting and empowering the next community? I mean, we are living in a data-driven time. Is that going to, and we'll end it here, Teresa, is that going to enable more progress? And how important is it to report that out and get that real-time data? Maybe not historical data, but what's happening real time. Do we have the technology to do that right now?
Yeah, that is essential with the impacts of climate change on the ocean. The ocean's changing fast, and it's changing fish populations in ways that we hadn't seen. And it's been really interesting. We have a small program that has partners in Alaska, and using traditional environmental knowledge, both to say where we've been, but to point out how different our oceans look now, has been really helpful in understanding how significant some of the impacts and the real-time changes we're seeing are on the ocean. And then also through some of the electronic systems the minister is implementing in Ghana, it allows for real-time feedback from the fishers to help inform scientists who can make decisions in consultation with the fishers again, because they are the ones who are taking the risks by fishing. They are the ones who have a vested long-term interest in the health of the fishery, and they should be partners in helping to decide what management measures work and are needed in order to protect this resource that they rely on.
Absolutely. And I love the idea of co-management. And maybe when we're talking about partnerships, we need to be talking about public-private investment partnerships and community partnerships, because that really sounds like is the key for especially this topic, to involve the community and give them voice. Thank you all so much. Fantastic conversation. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Professor Andrew Natsios, Executive Professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, and Dr. Katerina Shinkaruk, Senior Lecturer at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, for a discussion on weaponizing wheat, Russia, Ukraine, and global food security, moderated by FP's Executive Vice President, Allison Carlson.
Hello, everyone. Hello again. Thank you to those in the room, and thanks to those who are joining us online around the world. As you've been hearing and seeing today, there have been so many discussions about the innovations that are really contributing to greater food security around the world and resilience. And, this conversation is also going to be focused on what happens when those systems are destabilized and experiencing extreme shocks, and what can be done to make those systems more resilient. The title of this session is called Weaponizing Wheat, and we're focusing in on this conversation about the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the withdrawal of Russia a few months ago, and the cascading impacts that's had for Ukraine, as well as other countries around the world. And we have two experts with us today who I'm really excited to speak to about this, not only about what the impacts are in the immediate term, but what are some of the cascading risks to global food security and markets around the world, and also what are some of the near-term and longer-term investments that can be made to ensure that there's greater diversity of supply, value chains, and those sorts of things to invest in the resilience of the system. So when we're talking about Ukraine and the agricultural sector, this constitutes about 20% of a country's GDP and 40% of export revenue, and I believe about a fifth of the workforce. And so attacking the agricultural system effectively and weaponizing food is having a tremendous impact and has become a weapon of war. And so, Katerina, I'd like to turn to you first. Having been from and coming from Ukraine, how are you seeing this impact the country, the war-fighting effort in real time?
Yeah, thank you, Allison. I will say that this disruption of the grain initiative has had obviously effects on Ukraine's economy, Ukraine's war-fighting effort, but also on geopolitical context more broadly, which brings me to the point that Russia benefits from the disruption of this initiative geopolitically and militarily. And I will say that on economic side, you mentioned 40% of foreign currency revenues. Well, that number increased from 2022 to 2023 to 60%. So currently, and 30% of Ukraine's arable lands are mined. So this has been obviously hitting hard Ukraine's economy, Ukraine's labor force, Ukraine's GDP, and as a result, it has effects on its war-fighting capability in terms of defense investments, in terms of including morale of the civilians and the military. Obviously, one of the goals in terms of war fighting that Russia pursues here is destroying infrastructure and destroying economy if it doesn't succeed militarily on the front line. So this is like the second front. And in geopolitical terms, I would say that this has obviously global dimensions for food security, but it creates avenues to exploit in relations with the countries of the global south, basically removing Ukraine from the market and increasing Russia's leverage and basically potential for building its soft power in the region. While in the Central Europe, it actually helps Russia exploit the divisions which have been, bringing attention to the headlines here and in Europe about 5 neighboring countries banning Ukraine's exports. And basically now it all comes up to Ukraine even filing cases to the World Trade Organization. And we can see some, very bitter fallouts with Poland. And obviously, all this plays into the broader goal of undermining unity in the European Union for Ukraine and supporting Ukraine more broadly, not just in terms of food security.
Absolutely. And, I think that's a dynamic that isn't as discussed are the dynamics in the region. Certainly, the exports and the impact on prices for those importing nations in the global south, which you mentioned, have been more reported in the media and those sorts of things. But how this effort is destabilizing the geopolitical dynamics in the region are something that isn't as often discussed. So I appreciate you raising that here. And Andrew, I'd like to turn to you, and from your perspective, you've mentioned that we've neglected agriculture for far too long, and the repercussions that has not only in terms of food security but geopolitical security. And I'm wondering if, reflecting on Katerina's comments, how are you looking at this crisis in terms of that destabilization and what can be done in the immediate term to mitigate it?
I started my career 30 years ago in international development, more on the emergency side when I ran the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance when President Bush 41 was in office. That's the office in AID that responds to civil wars, famines, and natural disasters. And I saw the result of disruption of the agricultural systems during civil wars, where the young men are taken into the militias and they live off the land, they do enormous damage. So I saw how important it was. We tried to increase agriculture. We did, but all of it went to Afghanistan and Iraq. I wanted to actually spend a lot more money in Africa. AID had a huge agriculture program in the 50s, 60s, or in the 60s when AID was formed, but we had an aid program in the 50s. 50% of AID's budget in the 60s and 70s was spent on the Green Revolution of Dr. Norman Borlaug's. So we were the principal mechanism. He told me once before he died that AID was a principal mechanism for actually operationalizing this stuff on the field. That has all massively declined since the 80s. And we attempted to increase it, and there were resistance from different groups. Who did increase it was President Obama, and we were different parties, but I was a strong supporter of the Feed the Future initiative, which continues in place, and it was a bipartisan effort actually in the Congress to, it's $1 billion more for agricultural development. One of the other things that I've done that I think I had a very small part in it, but in the late 60s to institutionalize the Green Revolution, they created the Western donors, principally the CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, which are, it used to be 17 or 18 research stations. It's now 14 because civil wars have shut down some of them. They employ tens of thousands of agricultural scientists and economists. And they have a banana institute in Nigeria, sorghum and millet in Zimbabwe, potatoes in Peru, corn and maize in Mexico, rice in the Philippines. And they develop publicly held patents on, not patents, but rights to
improve genetics, not GMO. That's too controversial. Though personally, I'm a supporter of GMO, and I think it's terrible. It's been politicized, to be very frank with you. We need GMO technology to improve agricultural production, not just in the private sector. We need it in the public sector. And the CGIAR doesn't do it because it's too controversial. But I chaired a committee for 5 years in the CG system called Harvest Plus, which breeds micronutrients into poor people's diet, because there are three major, according to the World Health Organization, three major micronutrient deficiencies: vitamin A, zinc, and iron. And they have very severe health outcomes. They affect IQ, for example, in children. Women's mortality rates increase because of anemia, because of a lack of iron. And we now know from the research done on global warming that warming will reduce micronutrients in traditional crops. So unless we do something to breed the micronutrients back in, nutrition is actually going to deteriorate. So we've bred 300 crops now, but we have to get them out to 1 billion people, and that's an interesting thing we're doing. So there is a technology answer to some of this. The other thing is the amount of water available is dramatically dropping, as you may know, for a variety of reasons, but we're going to have water wars at some point. And so there are new irrigation technologies. They're not that new, but Israel developed some of it with drip technology. So that's another issue. But in terms of the current crisis, one of the things I learned in disaster management is human systems can take one shock. Then the second shock comes, you destabilize. 3 or 4 shocks, the system collapses. So we now have 4 major shocks going on to the world food system, which feeds the world. Most of it is private. 95% of the world food system is private, and it hasn't been studied that much. Only 5% or 6% of it is public. We think of the World Food Program and USAID food and the European Union, the Japanese, Canadians, and Australia. But the reality is that that's a very small percentage to feed the world. So the first shock is that we have a huge refugee crisis, and this predates the war in Ukraine. That made it much worse. So we have 80 million people, the most since World War II, who are displaced, or it's forced migration, either internally displaced or refugees. Some can support themselves by finding jobs. Most have to be fed or they will die. And that is putting severe stress on the international aid system.
Indeed. If I could jump in for 1 second. Certainly, these issues are multifaceted and complex and absolutely far-reaching. And I'd like to turn back to the near-term interventions that can potentially be made now to address the destabilization in the context of Ukraine. And so, Katerina, if I could turn back to you, understanding the issues are certainly complex, but are there any near-term interventions that come to mind for you that are practical, realistic, and actually feasible in light of the context that exists right now in and around Ukraine?
Yes, this is a very good question. Obviously, the UN is a great place to discuss those interventions. As I mentioned previously, the Global South actors play a big role, and it is important to bring them on board. And this is also a way, to actually think of how the soft power campaigns are being waged in the South, in the Global South countries. It's like one of the angles of bringing them on board. It's important because, in 2023, Russia's soft power global index rank was, just dropped by 3 positions from 9 to 13. And we have, 2/3 of global population supporting Russia. So basically, supporting, being neutral or leaning. But my point here is that it is very important to win the public opinion in the Global South and to bring them on board here at the UN. In terms of practical interventions, this could also bring us to the conversation about UN reform and making UN more efficient. And this is an existential conversation for this institution, I believe. when it comes to local, regional security and the intervention that could be made locally, of course, it is very important to keep providing Ukraine's security, air defense security, because the current alternative route for grain exports in Ukraine are river ports in Danube, which are being heavily shelled specifically by the Iranian drones. So air defense for those ports. And on the broader scale, you know, the more deterioration Ukraine experiences with this war, the more effect it produces on its ability to actually be a contributor to food security, the more dire effects we will see in the medium term. So again, it all boils down to helping Ukraine, you know, survive as a state, and to local security issues, including in the Black Sea, per se, as we can see that, you know, some recent successes were achieved by Ukraine's military, specifically in the Black Sea, and of course this, you know, support from the Western partners is critical here as well.
Absolutely. And so, in the context of this week, if you were to see a few actions taken and outcomes, what would they be? If you could pinpoint, you know, what would be a win for you in the context of this crisis?
Well, I would definitely see as a win finding some constructive ways to discuss the tensions currently existing between Ukraine and its Central European neighbors, because this plays against, you know, the overall calculus for the Western support, and Russia is applauding to that. And I would definitely see as a success some progress made on tangible measures taken in terms of, or agreements made in terms of reforming UN. Specifically, there are some conversations about potentially introducing the rules that would allow to overcome a veto with 2/3 of the votes of the member states. That's one of the potential avenues to make UN actually a more efficient player here. And definitely, I wouldn't find helpful any, you know, discussions about resuming grain initiative on Russia's conditions and providing it with the leverage to blackmail international community, but rather actually bringing it back to the international law framework.
Great, that's pointed and constructive, and it's a good point of what could work and just what will not be helpful at this stage from your perspective. So thank you for surfacing that. And I think this issue is so acute and it's so pointed and really underscores the importance of supply chain resilience and the investments that need to be made to ensure that for food systems around the world. And, you know, when you think of, Andrew, over to you, when you think of the critical choke points that exist, I think this issue is very instructive for, you know, how we think about vulnerabilities in our global system, global food system. And in light of that, what are some of the concrete and pointed investments and priorities from your perspective that need to be made? I know earlier you were talking about some longer term and complex issues, but how should we be thinking about protecting those choke points and diversifying our supply?
Well, right now there are 14, 15 choke points on the high seas that affect the world food system, and they do because something like 70% of the calories we all consume are at some point or another on the ocean, and because it is a world food system, privately maintained. Right now, there are 200-300 ships waiting to go through the Panama Canal, and they can't go through because there's not enough water in the locks to get through. And as a consequence, a lot of that is food from Texas. There are animals actually in some of those ships from Texas, cattle going to Asia. And going all the way around the tip of Latin America, South America, does not work in the case of some of the ships. So I'm not sure how to fix that from an engineering point of view. Part of that is El Nino. So if you take global warming, you put on top of it, you layer El Nino. That is why we're seeing these very odd weather anomalies. In California, they call it a river of water from the sky, flooding large parts of Northern California. that is El Nino, because what happens typically with El Nino is it reverses what, if you're a drought-prone area, it makes it very wet. If you're a wet area, it makes it, it eliminates the water or rainfall. And so typically we see huge disruptions in the agricultural system. And we're seeing that right now. It started earlier this year. Some say it'll end the end of this year. Some people predict it won't be to the end of next year. Let's hope it ends this year, because it's disastrous in terms of rice production, for example, in Asia. Xi Jinping apparently is obsessed now with the food supply of China because of this. I don't have an engineering solution to the Panama Canal, and we can't affect the immediate impact of how long El Nino lasts, but it's having an effect. We can deal with the problem of this mass displacement. It's caused by political upheavals. There is no government in Khartoum right now, effectively, because there's a civil war going on between one of the elements of the government that used to be the Janjaweed militia that has been indicted for genocide before the world bodies in The Hague, and they can't prosecute anyone because no one's been arrested. But the fact that there's no government, 1 million people have left Egypt already, for Egypt and other countries, and so this displacement has political roots. 8 African countries have had coups in the last year and a half. And one of the analyses I've seen is they're all driven by rapid increases in food prices. We know food affects political stability. The so-called Arab Spring, no one calls it a spring anymore, and 6 countries in the Middle East were all driven by massive food price increases. I tried pointing that out in Washington. People said, no, it's oppressive governments, it's corruption. I said, no, it's not. It's food price increases. That's what causes people to displace their government on the streets.
I think your points are really well taken, and I think what's been underscored here is there are concrete actions and steps that need to be taken to address the current crisis in the moment, but also these complex, intersectional, and multifaceted issues need to be thought through, planned for greater preparedness going forward, because agricultural systems are so vital to lives, livelihoods, and ultimately our security. So I appreciate both of your perspectives and sharing your experience with us, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
And now, please welcome Elżbieta Klein, CEO and Director General of the International Fertilizer Association, to the stage for a conversation on sustainable agriculture at scale with FP's Andrew Solinger.
Good afternoon. Let's pick it up a little bit. Good afternoon. Thank you. I know it's late. We have so much great content left. By the way, in addition to this fantastic conversation with Elżbieta, we'll be speaking with Food for the Hungry, and we're going to finish off with actually a new addition, Scott Nathan, who's the head of the International Development Finance Corporation. So please do stick around for that. That should be an interesting conversation as well. Elżbieta, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're really looking forward to this discussion on fertilizer. If you were here earlier today, you heard some of my conversation with Agnes Kalibata, Dr. Kalibata, brilliant head of AGRA, and we talked a bit about fertilizers in Africa and the importance of building an indigenous fertilizer industry in Africa to reinvigorating the soil there. IFA has a massive role to play in that. But I really just wanted to start really quickly, if you would, Elżbieta, just describing IFA. What is it? What's the mission? What do you do at IFA?
Right. So first of all, great to be here in front of you, and great to come after Agnes Kalibata, dear friend. So what is IFA? International Fertilizer Association, one of the largest and oldest industry association, established in 1927. We have a very simple mission, and I say simple in quotes, help feed the world sustainably. And it took us many, many years. Actually, it took us the war in Ukraine to figure out that without fertilizers, we do not know how to feed the world. There is 7-8 billion of us today. There's going to be 10 billion of us in 20, 30 years. And we have to figure out how to feed ourselves sustainably.
Very good. So you told me before this discussion that We don't know how to feed ourselves.
No, we don't.
My mother would agree with you, but that is not, I think, what you were saying. What do you mean by that? We don't know how to feed ourselves.
There is a lot to be done in feeding ourselves better. And on this stage, we have heard earlier today about food systems transformation based on the UN Food Systems Summit. So what it means is that to grow food that we eat every day, we need 3 macronutrients. And those are basically potash, phosphate, and nitrogen. And we haven't figured out, our biology, chemistry, physics research hasn't figured out how to do it without those nutrients. And Andrew, we talked about it in our earlier conversation. Agriculture is like banking. You can quote me on that. Why is it like banking? Because when you plant something, that plant takes nutrients from soil. And those nutrients need to be replenished. And they can come from sources which are mineral fertilizers. They can come from organic fertilizers. They can come from anywhere. They can come from microbes. They can come from biologicals. But fundamentally, the equation doesn't change. You grow a plant, the plant takes nutrient from soil, and we have to replenish it. And it took us all the way to the war in Ukraine in 2020, in last year, to figure out that without fertilizers, in whatever form and shape they come, we do not know how to feed ourselves. And 2 out of these critical 3 fertilizers come from the ground. They are mined commodities, potash and phosphate, so they have issues related to mining. But 1 needs a lot of energy to be produced, and that's ammonia. And we haven't figured out at scale how to actually do that.
So how are we working on that project to try and figure out how to do that sustainably at scale?
We need a whole lot of renewable energy to make it happen. So we are sitting here at the Climate Week, and the critical piece for getting ammonia to be green, green ammonia, is to scale up to the power of N, the renewable energy available to actually produce ammonia. Fortunately, here in the United States, we have done a piece of legislation called IRA, which allows to produce ammonia using carbon sequestration. And that's a huge step. So that's called blue ammonia in the language of chemistry and engineering. And that goes a long way to sequester some of the carbon related to production of ammonia. But we have a long way to go to do that at scale. We have a long way to go to get it to other countries outside of the United States, and also to produce ammonia closer to where it's used, closer to the farms, using biomaterials and other products.
So, we're going a long way there. Tell me about the most important considerations for making farming and fertilizer more sustainable. How do we have to think about that?
So I think the critical piece is to take into account that agriculture accounts for about 1/3 of the global emissions. And what we have to think about is the entire value chain. We have to think about all the way from the farmer to the consumer. And when you say that you want to decarbonize, we have to decarbonize the whole value chain. This is not about commitment at the level of one of the FMCGs, fast-moving consumer good companies, saying, okay, we'd like to decarbonize the value chain. Because the closer you get to the farmer, the more work needs to be done. And we have to work at that level from the beginning, from the farm all the way. So how do we go about it? We start at the farm, and it's about scale. We know how to do low-carbon agriculture, but we haven't figured out how to scale it, and we need to find a way to scale it. So at IFA, we have a broad 10 strategy. We invited everyone to join us. If you produce fertilizers from organic sources, welcome. If you produce fertilizers from microbes, you are welcome. We have a startup program. We bring startups to work with us and to help us scale it. We welcome all the initiatives by the government here in the United States, but also elsewhere, to scale up startups in climate smart agri, because that's the way to go. And then we have to work with farmers to adopt these practices. And we have heard on this stage that for farmers to adopt those practices, there have to be incentives, there have to be some carrots to be able to do that. I think we have the theory right, but we have to really scale it up. That is the name of the game.
Can we talk a little bit about unintended consequences when we try and move towards sustainability and things that might occur that we really don't expect to happen, that take us in the wrong direction?
Food systems are inherently extremely complex, and you try to move one part of it, and you actually can mess up quite a bit elsewhere. So let me give you an example. Ammonia is being used today, or is being considered today, potentially as a fuel for ships, as a lower carbon shipping fuel. it doesn't take a lot to think about a situation where large shipping companies are going to be purchasing ammonia. And needless to say, they have much better resources than poor farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. So that ammonia will be priced for the shipping. And what I worry about is what happens to farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, what happens to farmers in Southeast Asia who are not going to be able to afford it. The second unintended consequence of things that we try to do and then we mess up something else is that ammonia can be used to help decarbonize coal energy production. And today we are seeing some movement to decarbonize in Japan and in South Korea. And again, that's great. We need to move away from coal. But at the same time, I have the same worries about the availability of fertilizers for poor farmers anywhere in the world. And I'm very proud of the initiative that we've done at IFA together with Rabobank and the Gates Foundation called Sustain Africa. Because last year, after the war started in Ukraine, we had a major issue of availability of fertilizers. And the industry, for the first time ever, stepped up, delivered discounted fertilizer to 1.5 million farmers in the space of 6 months. So very proud of what can be done when you have a meeting of minds of public sector, private sector, few incentives in there, and you can actually deliver to the farmer what they need to have.
What is the biggest challenge that you face right now in galvanizing those kinds of partnerships? You know, one of the things we were joking about, fertilizers, when we think about agriculture, when we think about what we're doing, they're essential. Not just necessary, they're essential. And there are examples in recent history of failed experiments trying to move from towards organic fertilization. Terrible scenario and collapse in Sri Lanka and the agricultural economy there. A year or two ago when this happened. How do we elevate that thinking around fertilizers and the IFA as you move towards sustainability when it is kind of looked at as something that's necessary but not necessarily desirable?
Absolutely. So I think a few things that come to mind. First of all, we need to realize that if we want to move into different type of agriculture systems, different kind of food systems, we have to do it gradually. There will be a transition. Just like here in the hallways of New York during the Climate Week, we talk about the energy transition. We will need to talk about agriculture transition. We know that we need to help those farmers to make those changes. So that's one. The second thing we need to think about is scale. The scale of today's use of mineral fertilizers is enormous. It's a scale that requires infrastructure, it's a scale that requires ports and shipping companies and everything else to get it to the farmer. And what we need to do at this point in time is to make sure that it's available. Because if we consider grains and oilseeds essential goods, you have to consider fertilizers essential goods, because without them, we are not going to produce in the quantity that helps feed the world. But the critical piece for all of us in the room and in the industry that I represent
and online
is to think about the sequencing of sustainability and food security. And some people will tell you, oh, we have to take care about food security first. And I would submit in this forum is that we have to do sustainability and food security absolutely at the same time. We do not have a luxury to take one and then think about the other. We have to go with food security and with sustainability in a food system together and today, not tomorrow.
Inexorably linked. That's a great way to end it. Thank you so much, Elzbieta,
Thank you.
for coming
Thank you for the
and
opportunity.
explaining to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Next up, please welcome to the stage Isabel Coleman, Deputy Administrator for Policy and Planning at USAID, C.D. Glynn, President of the PepsiCo Foundation and the Global Head of Philanthropy at PepsiCo, and Mark Viso, President of Food for the Hungry. This panel discussion on fostering resilient food systems is moderated by FP's Allison Carlson.
I'm very excited about this conversation. Thank you all.
I'll let you do it. It's very warm.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So we're talking about building resilient food systems. What does that mean? And what are we talking about? Resilience has been increasingly in the lexicon discussed, in some cases a bit of a buzzword. And so when we're talking about resilient resilient food systems, what are we talking about? Mark, I'd like to turn to you. And you, your work, your organization is really focused on strengthening value chains and embedding resilience in food systems. So what does that mean? How can you characterize that for us?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great framing question for our discussion, and it's a real honor to be here. Thanks for inviting us. Great to be here with USAID. He's been leading in this space globally. With PepsiCo, has been so involved in public-private partnerships and with civil society. So great to be with you on the panel. You know, a little bit of context. If you zoom out, you know, as the World Economic Forum warned us earlier this year in Davos, we are looking at an onset of what they call a polycrisis, where we have multiple pressures: climate, conflict, interruptions in the value chain, disease, where risks and crises sort of converge in a devastating way that kind of erodes resilience. So with that context, I think that resilient food systems and approaches really are those systems that effectively manage those overlapping, interconnected risks and crises, shocks, events, but also stressors, long-term trends that are putting pressure on things. I think, though, and we're certainly guilty of this in our sector, and I'll just speak for our sector, the civil society sector, we far too often are prevailing approach, especially in hard places where Food for the Hungry works, in 20 of the harder places around the globe, you know, has focused on food production, generally at the community or local level, the farmer level, and it's mostly been a mix of humanitarian assistance with agriculture and livelihood interventions and support. And I think what we're missing are the essential components necessary for a sustainable food system, which is resilience. And I'm almost done in resilience. I think what we need to do and what Food for the Hungry is trying to do is build the 3 capacities that are necessary upfront to anything, even before you get to sustainability, even before you get to interventions around resilience. Absorptive capacity: can you take a shock, withstand it, not get knocked down, knocked out? Adaptive capacity for resilience: can you pivot, can you change, can you shift to another value chain? And transformative capacities: can you change or build a more accommodating system to overcome these shocks and stressors and go to scale? That's how we're approaching it. That's what we're looking at. We're trying to build that in our new program model, along with systems practice that we can talk about more, and human-centered design, putting those we serve at the core of everything we do and helping them determine their own future.
Thank you, Mark. That's really helpful. And, you know, when we are facing these complex crises and multiple factors at play, Isabel, I'm wondering, from your perspective, how do you and how does USAID think about resilience as kind of an organizing principle and a framework for your strategy? How can that be a way to assess risk and also really target interventions that will strengthen food systems and value chains?
Thank you. And it is great to be on a panel with different parts of I think, what the solution has to be here. You know, look, humanitarian assistance, last year, USAID did $13 billion in humanitarian assistance, and it's not enough, you know, and we've just, our Congress has just allocated another $1 billion in humanitarian assistance. It's just not enough to meet the growing needs. Today, there's 750 to 800 million people in need of food assistance, and you know, the billions and billions is just simply not enough. So Mark is exactly right. We have to be building more resilient food systems. I just came back from the African Food Systems Forum in Dar es Salaam the week before last. There were almost 5,000 people there working on this exact issue. And I can tell you, it's a really thorny, nutty problem. It's a very intricate problem to solve, and it's not like many people haven't been working on it for a long time, but we're not doing well enough. So it's a combination of investing in all of the infrastructure that Mark is talking about, making sure that we have infrastructure and technology today, even drought-resistant seeds, targeted fertilizer to get to the smallholder farmer. When the crops are grown, transportation to move it, cold storage. All of these things have to come together in an integrated food system way. And of course, being cognizant of the impacts of climate. I mean, one of the systemic ways that we're addressing it is at USAID is we are actually combining our climate work and our food security work into a new bureau, recognizing that the shocks that Mark referenced, they're the new normal. This is the new normal. And we have to be absolutely cognizant that it's not a shock this year. It's going to happen next year and the year after. And we have to be making the investments in a more completely resilient system. And look, technology is not a silver bullet, but we are bringing new tech to bear on this. I'll just give one quick example. USAID has a long-term partnership with NASA, and we've been able to leverage geospatial data and pinpoint it directly into the hands of farmers so that farmers can understand better what the condition of their soil is, so that they know what types of farming techniques they should be using and the type of fertilizer. It's not any type of fertilizer, it's specific to the soil so that they can use less fertilizer in some cases, or certainly waste less. So this project that we've had has helped some farmers waste up to 80% less fertilizer. So that's just one way of building in resiliency.
A few of the things you said really struck me, and one of them is there are so many people working on this. We need to do more. And then the example that you just gave, I think, really illustrates how there can be innovative partnerships that are leveraging the complementarity of skill sets, where different organizations, entities, agencies are best positioned to contribute, and how can you best align your efforts so that you're really driving impact, driving efficiency. And so it's not just technology, which is so important, but it's innovation in the types of partnerships and frameworks in which you're addressing these issues. And then another thing that you mentioned about sustainability and food security, and that came out of the last conversation as well, and how inextricably linked they are. And Sidi, I'd like to turn to you. I know we were talking before about some of the projects that PepsiCo is really rolling out that integrate just that and making sustainability commitments that are core to your operations. And can you speak to that a little bit and provide some of the examples that you're working on with regenerative agriculture, water, and other ways in which you're really embedding sustainability into the value chain?
Thanks, Allison. Thank you, FP. It's great to be on the stage with USAID, Food for the Hungry. So why is PepsiCo on the stage talking about food security when we make soda? No, well, we're much bigger than, quote unquote, a soda company. We're one of the world's largest food and beverage companies. We source 30 crops from 60 countries around the world. We have an employer base of more than 300,000 people and operating 200 companies, and we're rooted in agriculture. When you think about PepsiCo, yes, think about Pepsi-Cola. Maybe you think about Gatorade. You probably won't think that we own Quaker, but we own Quaker, so we care a lot about oats. And we care a lot about toes. We care about Doritos, Tostitos, Fritos, a lot of toes. Those products that we enjoy, they're made from corn. Doritos is corn. Lay's potato chips is about potatoes. And so agriculture is core to our business. We're an agricultural company. Everything that we use and those ingredients, they are coming from the land or from natural resources. So, 2 years ago, we launched an initiative to be a positive force for good in the world, and it's called PepsiCo Positive. And this is where, Allison, we put sustainability and human capital at the center of everything that we do, how we're going to create value and grow as a company, operating within planetary boundaries, but doing more good for people and planet. So great products, but we really are rooted in agriculture and care about people and planet. And so with this PepsiCo Positive agenda, it really is about being positive in our agriculture, how we source. I mentioned 30 crops, 60 countries. That's over 7 million acres of land. We want all of that land where we're sourcing from to be under regenerative agriculture. So regenerative agricultural practices is what we're doing across that. We're looking at positive in our value chains. We use a lot of water, but we want to be net water positive, and we have clear goals to get there on being net water positive, where we're replenishing and using even more water than we actually utilize. And then we think about positive in our value chains, the choices that we put out in the world, and that could be thinking about a bag of chips and that bag being biodegradable and compostable. So really that the choices that are being made, that they're positive. All of this is we're all about putting all this together to to transform the food system and to create a sustainable, regenerative food system. So in agriculture and products, and I lead our foundation and all of our social impact efforts. So when we're talking about regenerative agriculture, we talk about that's how we're farming, how people are farming. We talk about sustainable sourcing, how we're sourcing. In my world, we deal a lot with who's farming. So making sure that it's inclusive. And that's a commitment that we have working with CARE International to support 5 million female smallholder farmers around the world, helping them improve their livelihoods, increasing their incomes, looking at increasing their crop yields, how they're using water in key programs and products, and also making more nutrition available for them and their families. So this is where a company is using our power from a philanthropic standpoint, but also what makes that program so innovative is that, yes, we're improving the livelihoods of those smallholder farmers, but we also are now giving them a long-term sustainable market, because when we're working with potato producers in Egypt or potato producers in Vietnam and Thailand or in Colombia, we're working on that supply chain. It's going to be regenerative. It's going to be sustainable. Women are going to be sourcing, but women are going to be farming. We can use that as a source to really take those potatoes that they're growing and put them in our supply chain. So now this isn't only a do-good program from the foundation. This is business. This is a sustainable food system that literally is creating this virtuous cycle of good, where how they're farming in a regenerative way, but we're creating a market for ourselves and for other buyers. The same thing in water, in terms of being net water positive and looking at our plants that use water and cleaning that water and replenishing water back. So this is where, as a company, we're conscious. This is some of it's funded from the foundation, but this is where the company itself, PepsiCo as an entity, we want to be positive. And we have strong partnerships with USAID in Western Bengal and USAID, where we have tens of thousands of smallholders in our supply chain that we're sourcing from, with USAID, working with them to build the capacity of these smallholders to produce more, to do it in a quality way, to enter into our supply chain and really integrating women into these supply chains. So this is where public-private partnerships are creating transformational work in the communities where people live and work. And we talk about our approach being local, so we go ultra-local. Where we are, we become part of that community. So being local, we want to be leading. For PepsiCo, we're a Fortune 50 company, one of the biggest buyers of agricultural products in the world, but we want to make sure that the solutions that we're integrating are leading, that you're using technology, that for us, resilience building is future-proofing. If we don't have a sustainable, regenerative food system, we don't have a future as a business. So this isn't a nice to have, this isn't a social impact guy, and some of you, my friends in the audience, know I was in government. I was in the nonprofit world. I was with the Rockefeller Foundation. That's when we were doing good. Now I'm with this company that's sort of saying the good that you have to do is how we're going to survive, adapt, and thrive for years to come as a company. So these programs with local nonprofits like international nonprofits like CARE, bilateral donors like USAID, global nonprofits like Food for Hungry, this is how we're doing business today. And 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen the private sector sort of saying, we have to make sure we're a part of the solution. We want to be a part of the ecosystem of players with nonprofits, with governments, and with business working together to create that sustainable food system.
Absolutely. You point to so many great concrete examples. And one of the things that you mentioned regarding inclusion and equity and capacity building, I know is front and center. And when we're talking about localization and making sure that the programs, the interventions that are so connected in terms of the global value chains are really oriented toward what's needed on the ground and being driven and inclusive by those who are on the farms and who are working in regenerative agriculture. And so, Mark, I'd like to turn to you. You are operating and working around the world, and when you think about your efforts for greater inclusion and greater capacity building, particularly in some of the hardest places in the world, how are you approaching that? And what are some of the factors that you're keeping in mind and that we should all be keeping in mind to make sure that the local communities are front and center?
Yeah, I think that, like your first question that kind of framed it, this one's now the meta question, at least for us. Because I think localization can become very transactional in the way we define it or the way we seek to move forward in it. And for us, at least at Food for the Hungry, we're challenging ourselves to reimagine who we are and the value we add and who decides if we are of worth. Do we add the value that should be added? Who gets to say that? And to me, that's really about localization. It's not just, extracting data from the local community so we can do better programming. It's about giving agency voice and power. And that makes us all uncomfortable, because localization is really about a redistribution of power, the power dynamics. To me, that's the fundamental precedent for real resilience. Do those we serve, do they have a voice? Can they say what the value you're adding is not the value we want? Are they the ones that get to evaluate if we have worth or not? That's challenging. I don't pretend that we know how to do it, but just asking the question makes it raw and uncomfortable, and that's a good place to be, I think. We are in 18, 20 countries. Many of those countries, we've been there 40, 45 years. And those same communities developing long-term trusted catalytic relationships. And by catalytic, we mean that there's nothing that we're bringing new. There's already a solution there somewhere. As Muhammad Yunus said, the poor are not a solution to be solved, but an opportunity to be unlocked. There is a solution there that just maybe hasn't had the fire starter. What can we do to that in service of those that want that solution to take hold? Or there's a solution, but it's slow, it's not going to scale. What can we do? I do think that this panel represents, 3 of the 4 components, and this is well-trod rhetoric, right? Public-private partnership, civil society. But you got, bilateral aid, powerful, go to scale, innovate, policy, the private sector and corporations driving sustainability, driving what matters, driving economic ecosystems that are dynamic and sustainable and enriching. Civil society, local, long-term, intimate relationships that provide a degree of bona fides and validation. And then I'd love to see the impact investors come along, There's a lot of capital that can be unlocked as trying to figure out how do they deploy that, right, with their own type of bottom-line thinking. I think we're on the precipice of that. I think what the World Economic Forum talked about these last 4 or 5 years around the 4th Industrial Revolution, these polycrises, that's a challenge, but the 4th Industrial Revolution, if we do it right, machine learning, like you talked about, sensing, all sorts of epigenetics, all different things offer an opportunity to think a little different, not just about what we do on the interventions, but how we do that, how we get that done, making sure that there's a power redistribution as we own those solutions. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you for that. And I think you raise a really important point about impact and questions about how we measure that. What metrics are we using? And so, yes, we need to be more data-informed, evidence-based to the extent possible, ensure that those programs and those investments are being targeted in the greatest extent and will have the greatest impact that they can. But Isabel, when you think about USAID and the programs that you have around the world, how are you thinking about impact and the metrics that maybe aren't always included and the factors that need to be considered when you're prioritizing in what is, a resource-constrained environment and you have to make hard choices?
Well, certainly, there are a multitude of metrics, but numbers reached, of course, is one, but it's really ultimately about a return on investment. How much more productivity are we stimulating? How much more financing are we putting in the hands of farmers? How much more of a solution to the problem are we able to deliver? And Mark mentioned, impact investing. I mean, look, financing is a huge challenge in this space, and it's something that we're really more and more focused on. We've been long focused on improving access to fertilizer, technical assistance to farmers, leading cutting-edge seeds, and metrics around all of that. How much more productive can farmers be? And with financing, here's another element that we have to look at. We just announced a first loss facility this week here at UNGA in collaboration with the government of Norway. We're each putting in $35 million for a $70 million fund that will help de-risk investing in agriculture around the world, but in Africa specifically, will help de-risk it for investors with the goal of, coming up with a $200 million fund that will be able to leverage $1 billion. There's a metric, right, where we want to see at least a 5x leveraging, if not more, on these types of financing facilities. And I will just give one other example on insurance, crop insurance. This is something that is the norm for wealthy farmers around the world, but it's the poorest farmers, the most vulnerable farmers who need it the most, and they've never had access to crop insurance. But now bringing to bear more technology that can help insurers really understand drought conditions and soil conditions and other things. It enables them to provide more cost-effective insurance, and we've worked around the world with different governments. In Kenya, we started this a decade ago. 900 farmers had access to crop insurance. Today, it's over 1.4 million farmers in Kenya have access to crop insurance. So, we like to see a hockey stick like that. Again, getting back to metrics, this has to be at scale. It can't just be a handful of farmers benefiting. It really has to be at scale. With the first loss facility, we hope that, as I said, it will eventually reach 1.5 million smallholder farmers, which will really allow a scaling on access to financing, access to insurance, access to specialized seeds that are drought resistant, whatever it is. It has to be a really high ROI and able to deliver at scale.
It's an exciting announcement, and it can also potentially be a model and inform other projects of that type and mobilizing capital in that way. And so it's an exciting announcement, and thank you for pointing to that. And as you're talking about the metrics and financing, and also the other innovations that can be brought to bear to scale, CD, from your perspective, what are you focused on and what are you prioritizing? Are there either blended finance or collaborative projects or other types of innovations, technological innovations that you're integrating into your value chain that are really enabling greater efficiency and driving that impact then at scale? I think you're operating on such a large scale, you can really move the dial.
Yeah, I often talk about our size and our scale is that, pressure is a privilege. Where because you can do more, you should do more. And we look at that as an opportunity and a responsibility. And so just the regenerative agriculture journey is front and center for us with the 7 million acres that we want to convert to regenerative agriculture, but not going it alone. And so even in the U.S. with ADM and with Walmart, both companies committing to long-term transformational projects where we're going to do 2 million acres apiece with those two companies. So PepsiCo with ADM, with Walmart. So big companies who can get to scale really fast coming together. I think another thing that from a private sector standpoint is really using all the tools in the toolbox. So when a company wants to step up, yes, we can talk about the capital and the cash that we have, but we also have a lot of other assets that can be used. And so that's that procurement capability at scale in terms of really entering into relationships where we are procuring and sourcing at scale, thinking about our people. These are 300,000 people who have the time, the talent, and the treasure to be a part of the solution that's there. So using our people in a very different way as an asset for us, our products alone. So, just over the past 3 weeks from Maui to Morocco to Libya, when we showed up, yes, our money matters and our money matters in funding organizations like World Central Kitchen or the World Food Program, but we have products. So delivering water, delivering granola bars, delivering real food products in times of need. So we have a lot of assets that we try to leverage in different ways at scale all around the world. And so I definitely am somebody who's a big proponent of blended finance and using catalytic capital, philanthropic capital to de-risk, to draw in others, to fill gaps. And so businesses thinking about all the assets that we have, again, our products, our people, our performance to deliver, and letting that be leveraged. I think that's what was really important that Isabel mentioned, that this all can be leveraged and combined together. So I think that we're in a really interesting time now where collaboration is key, and even the company such as mine that wants to win in the marketplace, we talk about, collective impact, and we talk about we'll partner with anybody as long as they share our values and our goals, and we want to get further together. So this is a really important time where we know that these challenges need to be addressed at scale, and we know no one company can do it alone. But there is a real journey and transformation happening around the food system, and we're seeing it as a system and everybody playing their part, unlike I've seen in years past.
We're running out of time, but I have a speed round question for all three of you. You all spoke to the importance and value of partnerships, and it's not a throwaway. It's absolutely the case that those partnerships need to be strengthened, new partnerships forged. In the context of the UN General Assembly, what needs to be focused on this week that will really materially impact food security? What do you want to see either focused on or come out of the discussions this week that will have a meaningful impact going forward? Isabel, can I turn to you first?
Well, I think ultimately it is about partnerships, and it's about partnerships. I'll take us back to where we started, about building resiliency, and coming out of this week, actual concrete commitments, to try new things, to put money on the table, not just talk, but real commitments. And those are commitments from the private sector, from civil society, from government. I look at what we've done here as a U.S. government. We've made a ton of new commitments here at UNGA this week and have done it in partnership with other governments. We've done it in partnership with nonprofits and partners who can really help us deliver on the ground. So, and look, not everything's going to be as successful as we hope it is. You just have to keep measuring and iterating and come back to the table with new commitments and new ideas and continue to drive forward to have the progress that we demand.
Well put. CD?
Let's let action be our default. I think I talk a lot on my team about results, driving results, relevancy, and relationships. So we need these partnerships to do more together. We need to be addressing the problems on hand, especially in this time and age, but delivering results. And so I think having that action as a default, a journey of 1,000 miles does begin with a single step, but let's start running. Let's go a little bit faster. Let's fail fast so we can succeed sooner. So I do think we need more experimentation. I think we need more action, and we need, even the commitments, but also the real action behind them. So I just want to see us do more. I want to see us do more together, and I want to see us go a little bit faster because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said there's a fierce urgency of now. The world is not waiting. There's a fierce urgency of now.
Yeah. You said one, I'll do two, I'll be quick. One, a real focus on systems, looking at things as interconnected systems. I think that invites partnerships. We don't have to be as jealous. There's lots of entry points as we see these challenges as interconnected systems that can be changed if we interdict in the right ways and think through that. So systems thinking, systems planning, I think that's important rather than just transactions. And second, putting those we serve at the heart and core of all we do, human-centered design. There's practical ways to do it. I've been doing this for 36 years. It's easy. I confess it's easy for me to forget about those we serve in communities when we're running around here in New York at UNGA, but let's make sure that we remember that those are the people who have to be equal partners in owning our collective future, but also their future, what that looks like.
Well put. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. We really appreciate you being here and the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Alice.
Thanks.
To wrap up today's Food Plus Forum, FP publisher and CEO Andrew Solinger will discuss progress on global food security with Scott Nathan, the CEO of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation.
All 10 of you, please come join us. We have many more online, but we're very grateful for you to stick around and very lucky to have Scott Nathan join us from the DFC. Really, really pleased before you head out. I know it's been a very busy week for you, but we're very excited that you're here. Just for a couple of minutes, we want to wrap up and bring it on home here on our food forum. So, Scott, I know that you, I'm getting lost on my Dropbox here. Here we go. I know that you made an announcement earlier this week about your investment focus in food systems. You had challenged the DFC to make $1 billion in investments in food systems and security and businesses by 2026.
That's right.
How are you on that goal?
Well, Andrew, thanks for the opportunity to talk about our work. You're right. We did make an announcement on Monday here during UNGA Week. After Russia's brutal further invasion of Ukraine, we had announced that we wanted to do $1 billion over 5 years. And I'm really thrilled to be able to announce that in just 2 years, 3 years ahead of schedule, we were able to do well over $1 billion of investments related to food security in many different types of businesses and projects. But it's an area that our agency, the Development Finance Corporation, is investing in deeply. We're building a dedicated focus within our sector priorities to focus on agriculture and food security. And we're thrilled to be able to have that result. The challenge now is to do it again. We're looking to do that level of investing, keep that momentum going, and double our food security investments again in the next couple of years.
That's fantastic. Maybe we could take it up a level. You could tell us a little bit about the aegis for that. You talked about Ukraine. And why was that so readily accomplished? Clearly, it means there might be a need for this type of financing.
Absolutely. It's a combination of the need, the problem that needs to be solved, and the opportunity to make investments. You know, the Development Finance Corporation mobilizes capital to the private sector, private companies, private projects. And we've been able to find, whether it's getting capital to smallholder farmers so they can buy fertilizer, seeds, the fuel they need, working on logistics to make sure that farmers' food gets to market, reducing a number of layers of middlemen by using technology to connect farmers to markets. We've been able to find that there's innovative businesses, that there's capital needs, and that's how we were able to find dozens and dozens and dozens of projects that comprise that over $1 billion. These are not huge projects. A few of them were, but most of them were in the order of $10 million or even less. And so that's a lot of work to close those transactions, to build up, to get to those kind of numbers. But you're right. There's opportunity, and we have to work with our partners to get there.
That's a lot of transactions, I'm sure, and a lot of good work by your team. The importance of food clearly being paramount here. You do a lot of work in financing as well, obviously. We had, as I think I mentioned earlier, Agnes Kalibata on stage, Dr. Kalibata of AGRA, talking about one of the principal issues in Africa being the debt trap. You know, being able to get out of the financial hole that a lot of these countries and markets are in and try to create sustainable agricultural systems and food systems. I know that you've done some innovative work in debt for nature swaps at the DFC, which aren't exactly totally focused on on food, but a direct corollary to food and agriculture systems.
Well, it's what the previous panel was talking about, is the connection between food systems, food security, and the climate crisis, and finding ways to address that. We're very interested in nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. It also happens to be directly connected to food, whether it's in the marine environment or the terrestrial environment. And as you mentioned, that's combined with the macroeconomic crisis that we're facing in many countries in the developing world, where they have too high a level of debt. We have higher interest rates, increasing burden of meeting their obligations. Those two things come together in the opportunity to do debt for nature swaps, where we provide political risk insurance for new debt that's issued to buy in the old debt, exchange old expensive debt expiring soon for cheaper debt that has a longer lifetime, makes it easier for countries to manage. That is the benefit of making them more resilient against economic coercion and from a macroeconomic point of view. But then we also get conservation outcomes out of the savings of making that sort of exchange.
And you make those conservation outcomes contingent on the debt financing? How does that work exactly?
So it's a complicated negotiation, but these deals have an impact component. They're like huge impact bonds. We provide the political risk insurance, which allows countries to issue cheaper debt, but that is conditioned on conservation commitments that are being made. And that's, in the case of Belize, preserving the barrier reef there. That helps with resilience to climate. That helps with marine ecosystems. In Ecuador, it was part of expanding the Galapagos Marine Conservation Area. The money that was put into a trust fund for the conservation funding is going to enforcing against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, something that was devastating the fishing stocks in that incredibly diverse and important ecosystem that many countries in the region, not just Ecuador, depend on. Reducing that kind of fishing activity is really critical.
Outstanding. One of the other elements that we have not actually hit on in today's food forum, and I'm hoping we could touch on this a bit, is food wastage. It is a tremendous tax on the food system. Certainly in profligate Western nations that we live in, just outright waste. and the carbon associated with disposing of that waste. But in less developed countries, we have a problem with cold chain storage, which is a huge waste on food, the inability to preserve it. What are some of the things that DFC is thinking about in that space to try and address this problem? It's something we've really not talked about today. It's a massive issue in food systems.
It's a great question. You really identified a key issue. I mean, getting capital to smallholder farmers on one level seems very obvious, but making sure their food gets to market without spoiling is a little more complicated. And so, as I mentioned previously, we're investing in logistics. Cold chain storage is part of that. We support a project in India, which is constructing 5 grains silos called LEAP, which really is incredibly important to preserve the grain, to keep it from spoiling. I visited when I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, a project that we funded that does something similar, that helps reduce the amount of time and the number of layers between getting product from the farmer to the consumer and to market. That also has the benefit of increasing incomes for farmers, but it increases the overall food supply by reducing wastage.
Great. I'm curious how your portfolio and how you look at regionally the world when you think about food systems and investments. We were talking about Africa. You mentioned a few examples there, a lot in Latin America. Do you think about that geographic spread intentionally, or is it more where the opportunity lies and where the need is?
Well, it's really where the opportunities and the needs are, and that takes us all around the world. We're in over 100 countries, and that's a lot to juggle from our headquarters in Washington, D.C., but we're really driven by the opportunity set and where the deal flow happens. So it turns out Africa and Latin America are about equal. They're roughly about 30% of our overall portfolio. India is the single biggest market where we're operating, and we're always looking to find new opportunities and new markets if they meet our criteria.
Great. So we've talked about a lot of different issues here today at the Food Forum, a lot of them very concerning about problems that we're having. I'm just kind of curious if you have anything, if we could try and leave ourselves on a positive note here that encourages you when you think about your investments in food and food systems generally, when you that gets you up and makes you think we can make a difference here.
Well, I'd say 2 things. I like the optimistic note to end on. First, I feel like the world has really rallied in the face of the horrible challenge that Russia's aggression has created. That's in all different ways. That for us, that includes trying to help in Ukraine. We've provided financing to farmers through local banks in Ukraine to keep their production up, to keep people employed. But I feel like the world has worked in numerous ways to try to meet that challenge. The other thing I would say that is an optimistic note is the power of innovation and entrepreneurship. And we're very interested in funding that. In the agribusiness sector, that means using tech-enabled platforms to help farmers connect with markets, to increase their productivity, to help them get finance in a way that's more efficient than they would otherwise. So I think as we bring this kind of innovative entrepreneurship and that spirit to bear on these problems, we're more likely to find solutions, and that's a silver lining.
That innovation is a silver lining. We heard that from Secretary Vilsack and Minister El-Meri earlier when we were talking about AIM for climate innovation investments. So it's nice to hear that you have that same consistent thinking through that. Thank you for all you and the DFC do around the world, and with the innovative financial solutions you're talking about and your accelerated focus on food. We really do appreciate it, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks to you and FP for this opportunity. Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thanks. Great. I just wanted to take a moment. No microphone here, so no need for me to stand there. And thank our sponsors for their wonderful work supporting this summit. It was obviously a long day, but very, very worthwhile. I heard some fantastic innovations and discussions and inspiring talks, just like the one we had just now. I wanted to just do a quick shout out to our partners, Texas A&M Bush School, Daughters for Earth, Food for the Hungry. Thank you so much, Jonathan. IFA, Unilever, the Walton Family Foundation. Really could not have done this without all of you. Thank you so much for your help and for listening online. And please join us if you can for our discussion on diagnostics, which will happen tonight at 6 o'clock with Roche. We'd welcome you back here. Thank you so much again.